Hello, I'm Aaron Glass. I'm a professor of cultural anthropology here at Bard Graduate Center and the associate chair of research programs. On behalf of our director, Susan Weber, and the chair of academic programs, Deborah Crone, I'm thrilled to welcome you all here today for this, the first day of this ambitious two-day symposium on the global legacy of the arts and crafts movement. For those who don't know or are here for the first time, here at Bard Graduate Center, we study the human past and diverse cultural histories through their material traces and the complex ways in which decorative arts, designed objects, and material culture mediate our own relationships with the past in the present. This work unfolds across the entire institution in our academic MA and PhD degree program, which attracts international graduate students, in our research institute, which supports visiting fellowships and symposia like this one, and through an expansive approach to public humanities, with its emphasis on making advanced scholarly research available and accessible through exhibitions in our gallery, digital media on our website, print publications and journals, and public lectures, performances, and other events in spaces like this. And in fact, just last week, this room hosted another two-day symposium on Korean material culture. These are the last two kind of academic programs of the semester, and we're thrilled to be hosting them. We do all of this work cognizant of our own location in space and time. We are situated in three landmarked buildings on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, in the heart of Lenapehoking, the ancestral territories of the Lenni Lenape, and a past, present, and future home to many indigenous peoples. One block away from the former site of Seneca Village, a community of African American and immigrant property owners that was forcibly displaced in 1857 to create Central Park, in a neighborhood and a city long comprised of global migrants and refugees from war, violence, and economic dislocation. It's in the context of our attention to historical, material, and cultural diversity that I'm pleased to introduce Antonia Behan, assistant professor in the Department of Art History and Art Conservation at Queen's University, and an alumna of our own MA and PhD degree programs. She's the primary organizer and convener of today's symposia, which gathers together a group of distinguished scholars from around the world to focus on the global legacies of the arts and crafts movement. Please join me in welcoming Antonia Behan to the podium and back to the BGC.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Before I start, I'd like to extend my sincere thank you to BGC for all their help with this as an institution dedicated to furthering research, innovative research on decorative arts, design history, and material culture across disciplines, timescales, and geographies. I really can think of no better place to have the conversations that we're aiming to have today. I'd also particularly like to thank Susan Weber and former Dean Peter Miller for their steadfast support throughout the years and also their enthusiasm for this event. This symposium would not have been possible without Andrew Kirker, Jason Brown, and Nadia Rivers, and it has been a true pleasure and also a great relief to be working with such diligent and considerate professionals on this. From Queen's University in Kingston, Canada, my home institution, I have to thank Adrian Kelly, Norman Vereno, and Diane Platt, and I also owe thanks to my excellent graduate student team, two of whom are here today, Sarah Shields-Rivard and Daria Murphy, who's also an alumna of BGC, and two of whom could not join us today, Bala Karcharduri and Mirabel Ancora. This symposium is made possible by the generous support of a Social Sciences and Humanities Council of Canada Connections grant, the Bard Graduate Center, and the Faculty of Arts and Science at Queen's University. And thank you especially to all of the speakers who are joining us from near and far. Before I turn the podium over to them, I'd like to offer a brief introduction to our symposium, some thoughts about the questions we may consider, and an overview of the format of the symposium. In 1887, a group of artists centered in London founded the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society, an organization that made claims for the significance of the decorative arts alongside the fine arts, as illustrated in this image, with the image of the artist and the artisan coming together on equal terms to shake hands. The society championed vernacular and traditional forms and the value of making by hand. In doing so, the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society took inspiration from the British designer, craftsman, poet, and socialist William Morris, whose views on contemporary life, economics, politics, labor, and aesthetics they largely shared. Morris developed a distinctive critique of mid-19th century industrialization, capitalism, and imperialism that promoted the value of craftsmanship and labor, the preservation of skilled knowledge, and the broadening of a definition of art beyond European fine art. And yet, although Morris's influence made him, in the mind of many, synonymous with the arts and crafts movement, it is important to keep in mind several key facts. First, and perhaps most surprisingly, Morris's own relation to the arts and crafts movement was somewhat ambivalent, as we'll see later. Second, although the ACES gave the arts and crafts movement its name, the London group was but one group among many across the world who were inspired by Morris's writings and practice. Third, and conversely, there were also many kindred movements in craft revival across the globe that did not explicitly take Morris as their guide. Exploring all three of these complexities will be part of our goal in the symposium. But let us return now to that second fact, the widespread influence of Morris-inspired arts and crafts beyond the London scene. Over the late 19th and early 20th centuries, arts and crafts communities were founded across the world, from Boston to Bohemia to Bengal. Writers and bookmakers established magazines to disseminate Morris's writings, to broadcast their own ideas and information about their enterprises, and to connect with other like-minded communities. In Russia and Ireland, for instance, philanthropic upper-class women began craft revival projects for rural communities, while in art schools in London and Lahore, and in Glasgow and Ghana, teachers advanced curricula based on learning traditional craft skills. These varied efforts helped create a larger climate of growing interest in handcraft, manual skill, and vernacular ornament. And yet, despite this widespread commitment to the crafts, the ideals associated with William Morris came to be mobilized by different groups for different purposes. The arts and crafts was both a tool of anti-colonial movements asserting the value of traditional practices and artistic forms, and a tool of empire wielded by colonial arts administrators interested in exerting control over modernizing indigenous industries. These two images, both by the artist, socialist, and president of the ACAS, Walter Crane, offer contrasting visions of the craft's relation to global power. On the left, we see a vision of empire, with Britannia perched confidently above the world, while racist and gendered stereotypes of colonies and their cultures languished on either side. On the right, we see an image surely closer to Crane's own personal political views, produced for William Morris's own magazine, Commonweal, in which personifications of the continents appear as active participants in a socialist brotherhood. The contrasts and the similarities between these two imaginings of global fellowship illustrate some of the ways arts and crafts artists were shaped by and themselves shaped empire. The idea for this symposium first took shape as a graduate seminar that I taught here at BGC in 2019, which I taught again at Queen's in 2021 and 2023. The course was a provocation and a challenge. Could we trace arts and crafts beyond Europe? Could we understand the arts and crafts in the context not just of industrialization, but also of colonialism? I wanted to bring together literature on arts and crafts with a variety of individual studies that I had seen emerge on craft revival from different area studies that it seemed to me had not yet been considered together. In doing so, I discovered that I was not the first to ask these questions, and indeed many of the speakers here today are scholars whose work I drew on the syllabus for these courses. 20 years ago, the study of arts and crafts began to be expanded beyond the London scene to encompass various regional diversities within the United Kingdom, for instance, in Birmingham and Scotland, and within Europe, for instance, Germany, Ireland, and Scandinavia. Other scholars looked at transatlantic connections, examining arts and crafts enterprises across the United States. This work culminated in two major exhibitions and publications: LACMA's The Arts and Crafts Movement in Europe and America in 2004, and the Victorian Albert Museum's International Arts and Crafts in 2005. These projects set the template for understanding different varieties of arts and crafts, especially in relation to claims of power and nation nationalisms. Nonetheless, with the exception of a chapter on Japan and international arts and crafts, this research remained largely Euro-American in scope. That said, my research did uncover a number of individual studies of arts and crafts influence across empire. These questions arose separately often in different area studies, with many excellent individual studies advancing new perspectives, including feminist, queer, post-colonial, and decolonial perspectives. What remains to be seen, however, is what a fully comprehensive, fully synthesized, and fully global history of the arts and crafts might look like. How then might we go about tracing this global history? As I suggested earlier, there are two main ways that we can approach this question. First, we might trace movements that explicitly took their inspiration from William Morris and/or the London Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society to explore how and why they selectively appropriated his ideas. Second, we might look at related movements that, while they did not have a connection to William Morris, arose in response to similar world historical circumstances and shared his concerns with labor, ecology, aesthetics, and/or politics. Let's outline some of the questions raised by the first approach. In designing the first iteration of my course, one thing struck me was how often I came across a particular phrase in primary literature of the period, the William Morris of Japan, of India, and even to some extent today. I don't think Steve Jobs is a particularly good example, but it was there on the internet. So fascinating as this motif was, it also calls out for questioning. On the one hand, the motif reinscribes a Western origin to arts and crafts, but on the other, appropriating the figure of Morris seems to have inspired nationalists and reformers around the world. How can we speak of these two things as being true? This recurring phrase alerts us not just to the fact of arts and crafts influence around the world, but something of its nature. It was not enough for those interested in the movement to follow visual styles or technical guidelines. For many of them, following the social ideas of William Morris was equally important, and sometimes more important. In the sessions today and tomorrow, I hope we will discover some of the varying and even opposing stakes of these claims and the reasons why different individuals and groups appropriated the figure of William Morris. That said, the basic and in view of his widespread invocation as a figurehead, ironic fact is that there is a gap between Morris and the arts and crafts movement. Although he was its figurehead, he did not found it. Indeed, when he was asked to write a preface to the 1893 Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society's book, Arts and Crafts Essays, Morris was curiously ambivalent about the value of a revival movement. At best, it could serve as a protest against current conditions carried forth by a specialized set of educated men, rather than being a genuine cultural movement across all society. What Morris himself felt called for was something far more drastic. He never himself clearly articulated what craft and design would look like after what he called the Great River of Fire, that is, the revolution that he believed would sweep all of society, upending the existing order and transforming all social relations. Importantly, though Morris valued craft, he did not believe that the crafts themselves held the power to change society, at least not to the extent and the ways that he felt called for. This is perhaps one fundamental difference between Morris and many of his followers. But if Morris's own views had an ambivalent relationship to those of the arts and crafts movement, his followers likewise had ambivalent thoughts about him. While also often held up as a founding hero, problems of charismatic leadership and the anxiety of influence also arose. To see something of these problems characters, let us consider an article by Horace Traubel from a 1904 issue of The Artsman, a Philadelphia-based magazine published by the Rose Valley Association, an arts and crafts community based in Philly. In it, Traubel imagines a dialogue between a member of Rose Valley and another unidentified arts and crafts enthusiast. In replying to the question, "Where is your William Morris?" the Rose Valley member replies, "If you have a Morris up your sleeve, keep him there. Don't send him over to us. We admire him, we love him, but we would not follow him." The same voice later explains, "We don't object to a Morris because we object to Morris, nor because his main proposition is not forever true. In fact, we object to Morris because in the real sense we are his best disciples. We are trying to build up a democracy on the foundations of which he was in fact a prophet." In this article, in the form of dialogue, Morris is invoked as a founder and inspiration, but Traubel concludes that, quote, we would have to reject him in order to live up to his ideals. It is clear that we're not talking about a historical Morris here, but a figure and a myth. And like all myths, what is relevant is the set of attributes and ideas he represented that can then be reenacted and taken up by others. Perhaps surprisingly, then, Morris had a striking influence upon and became an emblematic figure within a range of non-European and anti-imperial thinkers. Booker T. Washington, the formerly enslaved writer and educator, used the language of arts and crafts and appealed to William Morris to secure white donor support for the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute. However, as Elaine Pinson has suggested, Washington did not just adopt, but adapted and transformed arts and crafts ideas. The idea of dignity in labor, for instance, took on a different and highly charged meaning for formerly enslaved individuals. Another question that recent studies raise is the complicated legacies of arts and crafts as both colonial and anti-colonial. Since the 1980s, scholarship on British South Asia has investigated the conflicting legacies of arts and crafts influence on colonial art schools and nationalist campaigns. On the one hand, craft preservation was a key aspect of colonial administration and policy. Administrators transported ideas about craft from London to the colonies and found themselves criticizing the modernizing influences, westernization of forms and patterns, and effects of industrialization on India's handcraft traditions and communities. On the other hand, although Morrisian principles of joy in labor, anti-industrialism, and respect for traditions were in play in the colonial policy, the agency of non-European workers and equality of the arts and crafts were not. For all his passionate defense of craft, the art school principal and father of Rudyard Kipling, John Lockwood, still placed Indian arts below that of European. In this way, colonial ideology controlled access to modernity and value and limited the agency of craftspeople. At the same time, however, anti-colonial thinkers such as Ananda Kumar Swamy, Rabindranath Tagore, and Gandhi drew on Morris and other figures such as John Ruskin as they refigured craft and invested it with the power to renegotiate economics, politics, and culture. The craftsman became a key figure of debate, representing hopes, frustrations, and calls to action within the independence movement. Notably, Gandhi's famous Khadi campaign asked his supporters to hand spin and hand weave their own cloth as a visual representation of solidarity, a symbol of self-sufficiency, and a practical boycott of British goods. I've just outlined some of the ways that arts and crafts ideas derive from William Morris and the complicated ways in which his followers use his ideas. Yet, as I have suggested, this is not the only way that we can understand it. The arts and crafts these examples are just some within a global wave of craft revival in the era of industrialization. How might we see these broader trends from the perspective of this symposium's framework? I would suggest that if we are to understand the global importance of craft revival, we must see it not as a movement that spread from Britain to the rest of the world, but as a common reaction to the conditions of industrial and imperial capitalism affecting the globe beginning in the mid-19th century and continuing arguably to today. Across North America, for instance, indigenous communities contended with preserving and transforming their customary arts in the face of cultural erasure and destruction of their economic opportunities. Such groups did not affiliate themselves with Morris and the arts and crafts in any specific sense. But how did their aim intersect with the production for settler and tourist markets and for the tastes of white consumers who themselves may have been shaped by arts and crafts ideas? One way or the other, I'd like to argue that approaching these types of questions, we can distinguish between Morris and the Morrisian, that is, between Morris the historical figure and Morris as an analytical tool. The author of a particularly holistic and intertwined critique of contemporary industrialization, capitalism, and empire, Morris gives us a lot to think with. Just consider the following list of some of his central concerns and ideas: the dignity of labor, the equality of the arts, a joy to maker and user, joy in labor, the earthly paradise, the art of the people, the past is not dead, and beautiful or useful. Moreover, when we consider these key ideals, we can see that they are not just a thing of the past, but resonate with current concerns. And perhaps in the interest of time, I'll just leave this as an open question of the ways that we can see craft revival and also the kind of critiques of industrialization in the context of climate change and overproduction resonate today. In closing, I would like to outline some of the aspects of the format of this symposium. Over the next 2 days, we will hear from speakers about a wide range of examples of arts and crafts influence across the world. I made the decision to name the sessions after titles of lectures by Morris, or phrases within them, to highlight common themes in what might seem like very disparate case studies, and to prompt discussion. I do not do this to argue for Morris's singular influence or agency in this movement, but in recognition that his ideas about craftsmanship, even more than the products he made, were ideas that different actors and theorists were moved by and took to make their own, and also to get us to think about these direct and indirect connections in each case. The art of the people reflects the fact that the Japanese word mingei translates to folk art, but it also raises the question of whose people and peoples are represented, especially under colonialism. The past is not dead reflects how claims of nationhood were constructed through ideas about the past, making, and collecting, and the full context of that phrase is, the past is not dead but living in us and will be alive in the future, which we are now helping to make. How shall we live then? Poses the question about the practicalities of craft economics under colonialism and also imaginings of the future. The Earthly Paradise takes its name from an epic poem by Morris and considers labor and materials, but more specifically, how we might narrate and imagine the connections that they afford. The last gift, according to Morris, was the gift of color, evident in the work of craftsmen in Persia and the Middle East, which was threatened under the imperatives of Western capitalism and the influence of the export trade. We will consider the dynamics of change and preservation, modernity, and adaptation within the context of colonial practices and European collecting. Finally, the aims of art, according to Morris, are to provide happiness, activity, hope, and freedom. However, according to him, it is the pursuit of these aims rather than the art itself that gives it its revolutionary potential. We will consider how the arts and crafts intersects with political aims in different cases. And finally, a note about the format of each session. Each session will include 2 or 3 papers and will not include a formal question and answer period. If we have time, we may discuss a little bit. Instead, the last hour of each day is reserved for us to come together in a larger discussion. To facilitate this, we will be moving next door to the seminar room at the end of the day. And the aim of this will be to compare different case studies, draw together themes, larger themes from the individual papers, and a bigger discussion interrogating the meanings and legacies of the arts and crafts. So with that, I'd like to begin the first session of our day and welcome our first speaker, Megan Jones. Come on up. Megan Jones is Associate Professor of Art History at the New York State College of Ceramics, Alfred University. Her research centers on modern Japanese art, design, and global flows of ceramics. Recent publications include Mingei in the Oxford Bibliographies of Art History, Kitaoji Roshanayan in New York, 1954, in Impressions and Ceramics in Modernity in Japan, co-edited with Louise Allison Court. Path of the Tea Bowl, a catalog she edited, is forthcoming from the Alfred Ceramic Art Museum. She received her PhD in the History of Art and Architecture from Boston University and an MA in Ceramic Craft Design from Musashino Art University. Thank you, Megan.
Thank you so much, Antonia. It's a delight to be here. Good morning, everyone. Are my slides coming up? Oh, I advance. Okay. The title of my presentation is From Eternal Beauty to Artistic Individuality, Arts and Crafts, Colonialism, and the Ceramics of Tomimoto Kenkichi and Hamada Shoji. I'll be looking at how these concepts overlap in the work of 2 towering figures in the history of modern Japanese craft. In their pursuits of eternal beauty and artistic individuality, Tomimoto and Hamada looked in part to the aesthetics of Korea and Okinawa, 2 colonized territories of Imperial Japan. The images here are two representative works I'll be discussing: Tomimoto's appropriation of Korean ceramics on one hand, and Hamada's of Okinawan on the other. First, some contexts. We see here the Mingei-kan, or Japan Folk Crafts Museum, established in 1936 at the height of Imperial Japan. Tomimoto and Hamada were instrumental in the Mingei movement. Mingei, as Antonia mentioned, a neologism stemming from Minshuteki Koge, or people's craft. From the 1920s onward, the Mingei movement has centered on recognizing and preserving Japanese folk craft objects and their creation, with Mingei comprising functional, ordinary, healthy objects of daily life for the common classes, produced by anonymous makers in quantity, according to the founder Yanagi Soetsu's criterion of beauty. The museum and Mingei discourse broadly incorporates objects from Japan's colonies, craft of the indigenous Ainu, and also Korea, Okinawa, and Taiwan, which we'll be hearing about next, are positioned here as exemplars of Mingei values. Tomimoto and Hamada formulated their aesthetic outlooks looking to address perceived losses in modern life within the urban cosmopolitan capital, which had been transformed in the Meiji era with structures designed like this Queen Anne style one, for example, by British architect Josiah Condor. And here we see the massive extent of the Japanese Empire from the 1870s to 1945. Is this blurry to you? Okay, sorry about that. It was clear when I formulated it on my computer. Okinawa's forced annexation by Meiji Japan was complete by 1879 with its establishment as Japan's, there's Okinawa, establishment as Japan's 47th prefecture. The Ryukyu Kingdom there, established in 1429, had been a vassal state to the Satsuma domain in Kyushu, southern Japan, here, since 1609, and had also paid tributes to China. Japan's forced annexation of Korea began with a series of treaties in 1905. Korea and Okinawa are also imbricated in a longer military history. In the 1590s invasions of Korea led by Japanese warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi, many Korean potters were forcibly brought to southern Japan, some of them in the 17th century, then forcibly taken to Okinawa. Recent important scholarship on Mingei and colonialist contexts includes a 2004 book edited by Fujita Haruhiko, The Arts and Crafts Movement in Japan, considering a spectrum of topics, particularly Mingei founder Yanagi Soetsu's similarities in ideology to William Morris, such as his interest in guild socialism. In the 2005 exhibition catalog, International Arts and Crafts, edited by Karen Livingston and Linda Perry, which I imagine we'll be hearing a lot about during this symposium, Yuko Kikuchi, in her brilliant essay, outlines the core tenets of Mingei in light of its nationalist contexts and the influence from arts and crafts. On the centennial of the Mingei movement's inception in April 2019, there was a special issue of the major arts journal BGC Techo featuring articles on Mingei's currency for product design, as well as the development of knowledge about Mingei. The cover notes that this special issue is about the rediscovery of things making up the world, therefore putting forth a relatively new and I would say refreshing aspect of recent scholarship globally about Mingei that takes up its international prominence. And coming up this spring will be, as many of you I'm sure know, an exhibition and catalog at the William Morris Gallery, Art Without Heroes, Mingei, curated by Roisin Inglesby. And in this project, Yuko Kikuchi will, there's an essay by Yuko Kikuchi in the catalog that, again, positions Mingei in a post-colonialist light. I also wanted to mention here articles by Nakayama Shuichi in the early 2000s that are important in linking Tomimoto's work to the British arts and crafts movement, as well as the work of Kim Brandt, who has published several important works on Mingei within Japan's imperialist political contexts. Now to Tomimoto and Hamada. Both had formidable experiences in the UK in their youth. Tomimoto in 1909, studying stained glass at the Central School of Arts and Crafts, and visiting the Victoria and Albert Museum regularly. Apparently, he didn't actually attend that many classes. He would go every day, walk from his room at Cathcart Road down the street to the V&A. Hamada was in the UK in the early 1920s, working in St. Ives with British potter Bernard Leach. Thus, they both had direct experiences and exposure to the arts and crafts movement as it was playing out at that time in the UK. When Tomimoto returned to Japan, he had several exhibitions describing his work in woodblock prints, dyed textiles, weaving, and leathercraft. He had a great range of work early on. He was describing this all as sho geijutsu, a translation of Morris's term lesser arts. And both, as I mentioned, were instrumental in the Mingei movement, though Tomimoto later would break ties with it, claiming that a modern artist's ego could not reconcile with the notion of an anonymous craftsperson. I'll also add that both went on to be designated living national treasures in 1955 for their ceramics. So Tomimoto was directly influenced by arts and crafts architecture, specifically that of Richard Norman Shaw and Philip Webb, as we see in his university graduation project of 1908, which includes a design for a stained glass window that may have been influenced by the designs of Morris. And it was in this important 1912 Bijutsu Shimpo article that would have circulated widely throughout Japan, in which Tomimoto praised William Morris for recognizing the importance of eternal beauty and artistic individuality, not only for fine art, but also for craft, thus resonating with one of Morris's key concepts, equality of the arts. Although in Japan there were some earlier works that were published on Morris's political and economic thinking, including a translation of the socialist utopian novel News from Nowhere in 1904, Tomimoto was the first Japanese person to publish a text on the design writings and philosophy of Morris. Tomimoto's early ceramics often bore direct references to the British arts and crafts movement. He inscribed here on this earthenware jar, "Eat and work, it's joy," a phrase extolling the joy of labor as parallel to Epicurean pleasure. In 1919, Tomimoto began a series of undecorated white porcelain jars. He first cited as an influence the so-called plump fleshiness of sculpture by the celebrated French artist Aristide Maillol, a sculpture that he had seen in Paris. And he also claimed an interest in pursuing pure form and truth, paralleling the notion of significant form as proposed by English art critic Clive Bell, as well as, of course, the British arts and crafts ideal of truth to materials. To be true to materials for Tomimoto was to privilege the white, undecorated vessel that encouraged in viewers a direct perception of materiality and form. Tomimoto's quest for eternal beauty also, I think, echoes the post-impressionist ceramics of Gauguin, who famously sought a wildness and primitiveness in Brittany, and also Roger Fry's modernist emphasis on pure form, while also seeking to leave the mark of the handmade in the objects. And as with other studio potters globally, to achieve artistic individuality for Tomimoto meant, in these vessels as well as others, commandeering all aspects of the technically challenging processes of ceramics. And these were documented in a 1956 series of photographs by Domon Ken. In May of 1921, Tomimoto helped Mingei movement founder Yanagi Soetsu organize an exhibition of Korean ceramics in Tokyo. While preserving these works in Japan, Yanagi put forth an ahistorical approach to eternal beauty, claiming the provenance of objects was not as important as their beauty, which he famously later would tie to Buddhahood. These statements then echo the colonialist notion of Nisen Dosoron, or the belief in a commonly shared ancestry between the peoples of Japan and Korea. Yanagi also wrote that Korean craft, including the Joseon dynasty white jars that had inspired Tomimoto, exuded a, quote, beauty of sadness, unquote. He described white as the color of sadness, representing the people of Korea. Tomimoto continued to produce undecorated white jars through the 1940s and 50s, to the extent that he is often described today, as leading craft theorist and historian Kaneko Kenji has, as a, quote, artist of form, unquote, and an artist of three-dimensional art, Ritai no Bijutsu. In Korea, Joseon dynasty jars like this one, famously brought to the UK from studio potter Bernard Leach, appeal to Neo-Confucian ethical aesthetics of modesty and purity. Korean scholar officials often would place vessels like this in their studies. However, collectors and connoisseurs in Tomimoto's circle ascribed to Joseon ceramics specific corporeal attributes that were stained with colonialist rhetoric, with the Joseon white jar a synecdoche for the Korean woman's nude body. Yanagi wrote of one such vessel, quote, "This jar reminds me of a human body. The beautiful skin is just like a warm human body, and I cannot help touching it. It is such white skin. It is a hidden submissive color, showing women's modesty." In one poem, the well-documented Korean ceramics collector Asakawa Noritaka went on to liken a Korean water vessel to a female breast, quote, "born in order to provide love," unquote. My dissertation advisor told me I could write a whole paper on just that one quote. There's a lot to unpack there. And Asakawa also described a Korean woman as, quote, "a walking jar." Scholar Yuko Kikuchi has argued that these types of sentiments reflected a, quote, male gaze projected by the Japanese colonizer on a colonized Korean woman, whereby the woman is an unreal, static, idealized image. Now turning to Hamada. This is a 2010 issue of the major ceramics journal Honoho Geijutsu that labeled Hamada a modernist of beauty, suggesting the complex mechanisms at play for a cosmopolitan, highly technically trained artist to replicate folk pottery styles of England, Korea, and Okinawa, all the while refusing to sign his work. Hamada first traveled to Okinawa in the summer of 1918 with fellow potter Kawai Kanjuro, and that was before Hamada went to work in England with British ceramist Bernard Leach. Hamada famously said, quote, "My work began in England, learned much in Okinawa, and matured in Mashiko." Mashiko is where he would establish his main studio and kiln, which is quite well preserved to this day. Each year from 1925 to 1930, Hamada spent long winters producing work in Okinawa at a rented workshop and kiln. Hamada's sojourns there took place during the rise of the Okinawan travel boom that began in the 1930s. Its subtropical climate recalls the draw of southern France to artists like Picasso, who famously also turned to a rural pastoral locale for the pursuit of pottery. Like Korea, Okinawa was central to Mingi discourse. Yanagi Soetsu remarked that only in Korea and Okinawa do women still carry things on their heads in the 20th century. And Yanagi said, quote, "Pure Japan remains best in the north end and in Okinawa at the south," unquote. Yanagi called Bingata kimono Okinawans wore, quote, "innate and original," and, quote, "purely Japanese." Mingei modern textile artist Serizawa Keisuke referred to Okinawa as like the mythical dragon palace. Hamada worked with Aragaki Eitoku of the Tsuboya kiln, known for overglazed enamels such as these. These were works featured in the 1972 book that Hamada authored, Okinawan Pottery. Hamada remarked that the throwing method and the overglazed brushwork came together in works like these to produce an enviable, refreshing sensibility. Like so many world ceramics traditions, Okinawan ceramics represent hybridization, given its active engagement with trade, particularly in the 14th to 16th centuries. And then the red overglaze technique stems from Satsuma ware of mainland Japan, which in turn drew from Chinese Ming Dynasty precedents. Some modern tea ceremony enthusiasts refer to Tsubaya vessels such as these also as namban, which translates as southern barbarian. So works like this also had that sort of context in their usage in 20th century Japan as representing an exoticized other. Hamada wrote in his 1972 book, The Men of Tsubaya Enjoy Their Work. The everyday life from which such attributes to work spring has a strength and simple vitality that we cannot hope to match. Where a more sophisticated potter asked to improve a pot by providing a design would approach the task with much hesitation and heart searching, the potters of Tsubaya do the same thing all the time without giving it a second thought. And the result is always pleasing. How enviable it is to produce good work without even realizing it. We who have long since lost this unconscious creativity can only envy them heartily. So, as with Tomimoto towards Korea, Okinawan ceramics and their processes symbolized, for Hamada, a pre-lapsarian past out of reach in the metropole. These two works by Hamada were made in Okinawa, and they both draw on 18th to 19th century precedents. Hamada produced many dachi bean or hip flasks, like the one we see on the right. These dachi bean were made historically for awamori, an alcoholic beverage manufactured in Okinawa from long-grained rice. So in usage, quite distinct from wares on for example, the locale of Mashiko where Hamada was based. These rice bowls also directly appropriate Okinawan forms and surfaces, with the sugarcane a ubiquitous motif beloved by Hamada and associated with the sugarcanes growing on the Okinawan islands. To conclude, while the ceramics of Tomimoto and Hamada, alongside those of artists like William de Morgan or Adelaide Alsop Robineau, do not bear stylistic similarities, all share an emphasis on individualized creation and colonial contexts in which the notion of an eternal beauty fueled various appropriations. How Mingei artists viewed Korean and Okinawan ceramics aligns in some ways with concurrent movements in Euro-America, looking to sources of inspiration in the Middle East, North Africa, and India. And those appropriations reinforced colonialism itself, co-opting what existed in the colonies as one's own. Tomimoto's stance towards Korea was akin to that of modern artists throughout the world, seeking unadulterated, pure aesthetic inspiration from so-called primitive cultures. Thus, what's different in Japan is, I think, viewing the material cultures of the colonies as direct, authentic sources of ancient Japanese tradition. For Hamada and Tomimoto and the Mingei movement members broadly, Korean and Okinawan objects symbolize the roots of Japan, not an exoticized other to be dominated by a civilizing force, but to them a perceived shared culture. Thank you.
I'd like to invite our next speaker, Louise Yang. Louise Yang completed her PhD in History of Art at the University of York in 2023. Her PhD project, Art and Craft as a Non-Dualism, Japanese Mingei Movement from a Taiwanese Perspective, examines the concept of craft, which has been previously explored by identifying its non-art properties, projecting European imperialism's influence in non-European cultures' acquisition of art. Louise is a holder of the Kuo Hosei Hu Award for only one researcher every 2 years. Currently, she works as a research fellow running the curatorial project Sunrise, Yan Shuilong and Taiwan exhibition, which is opening in the National Taiwan Museum of Fine Arts in March 2024. Welcome, Louise.
Thank you, Antonia. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to meet you all here. My interest in craft occurred to me with a focus on the art and craft dualism, which I explore with post-colonial connections to other sets of dualisms, such as the individualistic and the collective, the conceptual and the material, and in the case of Japanese Mingei movement, the Oriental and Occidental. In my presentation today, I'd like to engage more in the idea of purity, as Megan stressed earlier, which was one of the most circulated myths of modernist art. Through analyzing Yanagi's Mingei aesthetics and its nuanced operations in Taiwan, my research explored a similar myth in craft that identify beauty as an independent and purified domain for daily objects. My presentation today will cover these points. I will bridge art and craft materials in Japan and in Taiwan for observing how Mingei aesthetics was applied as a wartime colonial ideology, through which I aim to demonstrate how the idea of purity in Yanagi's Mingei theories was replaced by hybridity in local practice. Let's start by analyzing different engagements of purity in art and in craft. In Bernard Lee's The Unknown Craftsman, he associates Yanagi's Mingei concept with the idea of deformation, which modern artists pursue as expression of freedom. In terms of irregularity, he made links to European modern artists like Picasso and Matisse. I'd like to explore the term irregularity further by reconnecting it to the British model of John Ruskin. In Yanagi's The Way of a Craft, published in 1928, his discussions of Ruskin's The Stone of Venice drove a substantial focus on an aesthetic domain navigated by Ruskin's concern of morality within beauty. Ruskin associates savageness and barbaric characteristics in Gothic art with the imperfections of nature. In Ruskin, this naturalist approach is obedience to the law of the universe and the love of natural objects for their own sake. This inspired Yanagi to interpret craft purity with a connection to the Buddhist connection. All the power is an open trust in universal creativity supported by the natural and collective intelligence, which denotes similarities to Ruskin's demonstration of barbaric characteristics in medieval art. Ruskin's naturalism is pivotal for Yanagi to construct his notion of originality. Ruskin urged studying the truth of nature, rejecting nothing, selecting nothing, and scorning nothing, believing all things to be right and good, and always rejoicing in the truth. This notion of truth is also seen in Yanagi's constructions of originality and freedom in his aesthetics of craft, taking nature as a purified domain of beauty. However, Yanagi did not appreciate the voice of British art and craft that much. According to Yanagi, Ruskin's idealism revealed his love of art, expecting all artisans to become artists. He said, "Things we lift from the ground, gaining spiritual sight in the heavenly realm. However, the heaven grounded on the earth is not found." This analogy between heaven and ground manifests Yanagi's belief in essential difference between art and craft. Then his harsh comments on the Red House that it's more than a painting than the residence, and the Party's wallpaper is unsightly. He thinks the design based on the rigorous geometric method gives no flexibility for human-made possibilities. It might be a kind of unfreedom from a human's perception. So far, we might be able to figure out that there was a certain form for Mingi objects, which was scope exclusively for craft. Yanagi coined the term getemono, which means ordinary things, referring to craft entity as a functional object made for daily use but not for decorated for individual expressions of beauty. This is interesting when looking at some of Tomimoto's work. Tomimoto's division from Yanagi developed quite early, around 1929, when Tomimoto expressed his disagreement on taking craft as only a kind of tool-making idea. He believed that the beauty of craft is not only about getemono, and questioned that craft making had been narrowed to exclude individualistic expressions and creativities. And wrapping these ideas up a bit here, it seems that Yanagi's definition of craft engaged in the purified domain polarized by art. If art is pure for being free in individualistic expression, then craft should represent the purity, which is only fulfilled by transforming natural materials into functional beauty. So a getemono should be ordinary. It can be carried personal expression that Yanagi categorized as art. I'd like to move on to the circumstances in Taiwan during the Japanese colonial period. Focus on some works by Taiwanese artist Yan Shuilong. He acquired Mingei as one of his significant sources for his design, but I'd like to explore more about how Mingei theory was altered in his own use and his rejection to the colonial aesthetic ideology. I assume Yan Shuilong sounds familiar to most of you. He was born in Taiwan in 1903 and studying oil painting at Tokyo Fine Art School, then traveled to Paris to study modern art from 1930 to 1932. His enthusiasm toward handicraft developed after a series of local investigation. Some detailed descriptions of these industries were published in the Folklore Taiwan, Minzokaku Taiwan magazine. The magazine was initiated in 1941 by Kanaseki Takeo, a Japanese medicine professor who was enthusiastic about preserving Taiwan's folk culture when the material life was massively changed by modernization and colonial assimilation. In 1943, Yanagi visited Taiwan and Kanaseki organized a trip showing Yanagi around with Yan Shuilong's company. During the trip, they visited Yan Shuilong's bamboo work revival organization in Guanmiao. Yanagi praised Guanmiao as an ideal room for craft making, and Yan played a significant role in introducing Taiwanese handicrafts over the island. However, he was not included in the symposium in conversation with Yanagi and Kanaseki, organized after the investigation. One of Folklore Taiwan magazine's writer, Tateishi Tetsuomi, made his comment on Yan's bamboo design, saying, "It is not sufficient yet, and still far from the realm of silence, far from the realm of hearing nothing from making." He also identified a kind of modern taste which he thought sometimes failed to accommodate Yan's use of materials. In another article, Tateishi used the term over-decorated to describe some crafted products that with patterns and drawing on them. He appreciated bamboo ware functional property in simple structure, while criticized those products with excessive artistic inventions by describing them as a meaningless waste. We may observe that the idea of Mingei was circulated as a wartime taste, an aesthetic ideology for controlling labor and natural sources, encouraging people to make daily objects manifest by their functional sake and material beauty, excluding expressive ornaments. So decorative forms were constrained in the colonial context. Yanagi's interest in Guanmiao bamboo craft derived from exhibition, selection, tradition, and creation organized by Charlotte Parent in 1941. When Parent was commissioned by the Japanese government to develop products for international market. During the parents' invitation in Japan, a Taiwanese bamboo chair collected by Mingi potter Kawaii attracted her. Bamboo artisans from Guanmiao were invited to Kawaii's studio to support bamboo craft making. Kawaii praised Taiwanese bamboo craft works, saying they were as self-evident as generating naturally from the bamboo itself. In contrast, in Yanagi's critical Harian's exhibition, he thought the Westerner was not familiar with the Eastern materials like wood and bamboo. He said their appreciation was superficial and did not respect the natural characters of raw materials. Unlike Yanagi, Yan Shuilong appraised parents' work. In his teaching materials, he introduced parents' chair design, juxtaposed forms in bamboo and metal. This tells us that Yan's source includes styles and materials from Western modernist design. We are more familiar with the story about Parent that she started using bamboo after his journey in Japan. I'd like to say if we take the exhibition as a interface, then the influence of international arts and crafts does not appear as a linear transmission from the West, then Japan, then Taiwan. We should take it as an incident that inspired all of these players with different possibilities. Yes, bamboo furniture design developed earlier in the 1930s. In 1954, he made a series of diagrams, perhaps as a research or teaching materials for the new established craft education institute in central Taiwan. Here we can find several sources of Western modernist design. For example, the low bamboo table might came after a similar project parent collected in rural Japan. In Yan's design, the detachable design was applied to combine with an elegant bamboo woven table. Yan used the grid as a tool for organizing patterns and weaving techniques. This might come from the use of notations in Bauhaus weaving workshop. But Yan adopted grid as a tool for representing weaving's visual structure, less as a notation that navigates interaction between wrap and weft threads. In this diagram, the grid was rotated 45 degrees. If we compare Yan's design with Basil's furniture design for the Rambling House, we may find many interesting similarities. For example, the horizontal line indicates that the table grounded in the space, and the table was separated into two halves, showing different sizes, different colors, and different process relating to the information making. The joint structure connecting two parts in Basil's design is also seen in Yan's diagram, although he erased it away. I have no idea where Yan contact with this design for arts and craft. He did make many surveys in Paris. However, it can't be ignored that the art school in Tokyo he studied at was in a cosmopolitan city embracing Western literature and artworks. The idea of Bauhaus was also very popular in 1930s Japan. A chair in Yan's bamboo furniture series looks parallel to one of Parent's armchair and Masaburu's Wesley chair. The operation of cutting a cubed space into semi-structure conveys the geometric language of modernism. Yan's design in the right corner was the only drawing presenting furniture in the architectural isometric view to convey their visual quality in the concrete space. I'd like to address that it might not be a coincidence that these chairs were captured in this angle. In Bauhaus photographer Zeitun's photo, three Wesley chairs were captured in the same way, and they were not deployed to align any wall in this room. I do think this angle is in purpose in Bauhaus visual policy. Then Zeitung's photo taken in 1926 appeared 4 years later in the monthly reports of Tokyo Fine Art School in 1930s, just a few months before Yan left Tokyo for Paris. Yan's adoption of European elements in his work is consistent but in a very random way. We can't spot any single linear narrative to scope the story. For example, objects of later development of the British arts and crafts, such as Ernest Gibson's design, can be a case for navigating Yan's modernist source. Now we can see how the linear narrative with a centralized origin failed to indicate the actual picture of the influence, which never was to show the transmission we expect within a certain direction, but reveals an open-ended, multi-centered, non-dual dynamic process beyond the imperial space of Japanese colonialism. I'd like to get back to our discussion of purity at the beginning of this presentation. In Menge theory, the purity of crafts was polarized by the purity of craft. A crafted object should be purified by eliminating individualistic expression from its functional and material essence. However, the idea altered in Yan's design. It is interesting that in Yan's book he referred to parent as a decorative. Decoration consistently exists in Yan's design, but they were not present as added elements onto a functional object. His decorative forms work with his understanding of Taiwanese visual culture. These forms are expressive in ways of breaking the dualism between art and craft. His works are not the pure type that Yanagi made for craft. In his furniture design, we can see Yan's playful arrangement of bamboo nuts, which shows his creativity to transform materials into expressive works. In terms of essence of craft, Yanagi associated crafted purity with collective engagements, which in Yan's individual approach was operated as a cultural hybridity. This case gives a view for restructuring the influence in terms of international art and craft. By seeing the altered meaning in its sites, bring us back to re-examine the modernist belief of purity that polarized art and craft to two ends of creativities. In comparison to Menge theory's attempt to scope an aesthetic domain only for craft, by excluding the idea of a fine art, Yan's engagements aim at non-dualism in an alternative way, giving artistic expression a free domain to explore the beauty that equally exists in functional work. This is in my presentation. Thank you very much.
I loved your talk, and I'm so sorry. There were some things I didn't quite understand. In fact, I'd love to read your talk, but were you saying that the comparisons between people like the Dutch de Basel table and Japanese makers, are those conscious, or you're seeing just links of like parallel play a few generations later? I didn't quite get the point of that. And I would appreciate a little elucidation.
Yes, thank you for the question. In my case with Yan Shuilong's art, since we are organizing an exhibition about Yan Shuilong, and we try to investigate a lot of material that and try to sort out what's the Western source that Yan Shuilong have used in his craft making, and we realized that it's very random. Like might be a bit earlier, like in late 19th centuries, like some design from the arts and craft in the UK, and also we found source from like more like European in Netherlands, like Rambling House. We found that there's many sources like we can't like make a story to figure out that how he used this material. So we think that might be related to experience in Tokyo, since at the time, the art school in Tokyo is very keen to embrace the Western culture. They learn a lot of literature from European culture and a lot of works of art that he can study. He could study in the magazine, so we can see that these sources has come to Japan at the same time, no matter they're from the late 19th century or early 20th century. So when Yan Shuilong cooperated this kind of material, and he traveled to Paris, and he also tried to get tied to the Louvre and imitating those very classic painting. So I would like to say it's kind of hybridity that how the artist try to cooperate with a wide range of artistic sources, and when he transformed that to craft making, we can't really recognize the original sources, and we can see what we can see is a kind of hybridity that he put in his design. So responding to the case like the chair, and we can find a similarity like how he kind of accommodated certain form, and also he depict the form by referencing those style. They will say there's more hybridity inside that how he accommodate this kind of forms into his use of a hybridity.
Thank you.
Thank you both. This is with respect to the bamboo furniture. And I'm not sure I heard correctly, but if what I thought I heard was a critique about the use of the bamboo, that this was an inappropriate use of the material, and if I heard correctly, was that with respect to how bamboo can be deployed, or was it with not appreciating the varieties of subspecies of bamboo, or the bamboo at certain points in its cultivation cycle? Could you elaborate a little bit on the bamboo?
Yes, thank you for your question. Bamboo is it's kind of original material in Taiwan because we're in a tropical country, so bamboo grow very fast. So for the local artisans, it's a kind of ideal material for making daily objects. And there's several techniques for bamboo, like how they join different structure together, and they use like steam technique to bend it, and also they need some like external tool to deal with like different size of bamboo and into craft works. But I think in Yan Shuilong's use of bamboo as a main source of a craft, that's from the exhibition I just mentioned. That's in Japan because it was so popular at the time. People keep talking about bamboo as kind of an ideal craft material for the wartime because, as I said, it's cheap and it grows fast, and most of people in Taiwan know how to make it. So it saves a lot of time and saves a labor for making bamboo. And I think at the time, bamboo was so popular since it also represents a kind of oriental form for, if I can say so, like Japanese view to see, and maybe the Western customer would like this kind of Oriental form, so they perform it for some purpose. So when they encourage bamboo craft making in Taiwan, I think for a certain degree is because its original source in Taiwan, we got techniques for making bamboo, and also local artists try to develop bamboo to the new form of modernist style for selling that around the world.
Thank you. Yes. Oh, thank you. This is a question for Megan. I was really interested in the sort of anthropomorphizing of the ceramics. Is Tomimoto, sorry, drawing on a longer tradition? I mean, is this something that you see in Japanese poetry and writing of creating kind of links between the human form and ceramics?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I'm reminded of Peter Dormer's well-known discourse of ceramics as being articulated according to parts of the human body. And in his book, he suggests a shared universal way of describing ceramics in corporeal terms. That's a fascinating question. I have not come across references historically to Japanese ceramics along those lines. Tomimoto famously also said, prior to the 20th century, I think there are sources that do use similar terms, but it's not something that I've investigated. As I was about to say, Tomimoto additionally described glaze as like clothing to the ceramic body underneath, and that's something that Bernard Leach also picked up on. And so there's a great deal of shared modern discourse linking the ceramic body to the human body. That's a great question. I wish somebody would trace that globally, and also look to, for example, the discourse of African ceramics, in which I believe there's also iterations of the ceramic form articulated according to parts of the human body. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you both. This is a question that could be for either of you, but I'm thinking about the conclusion of your talk, Megan. And I'm thinking about the relation, and this is anticipating maybe more conversations today, but the relationship between the folk and the indigenous as sort of categories in colonial discourse. And I was particularly struck by one of your concluding points that the discourses you were of influence that you were tracing used a kind of language of affinity and not exoticism, not the exotic other, but the absorption into the Japanese imperial imagination. And I'd just like to hear more about what other kinds of evidence people were using to absorb those in the imperial orbit into the category of folk, to claim kinship rather than otherness in this context. And it's thinking with the kind of contrasting category of the indigenous, where similar appropriative gestures occur, but maybe with a different kind of language.
Indeed, thank you for the question. There's a wide discourse and a large body of scholarship on this very question, and as a lot of Mingei scholars have explored, there are nuances differentiating, how various colonized locations were home to particularized understandings of craft according to colonialist ideologies. So in the Mingei-kan, for example, you'll see many examples of Ainu craft. The Ainu being Japan's indigenous peoples. There's whole rooms generally in the Mingei-kan devoted to the ceramics of Korea. In part, I think, because Yanagi Soetsu, who's reified as the great founder of Mingei, pointed to a Korean Joseon dynasty work of ceramics as the initial inspiration for looking to Mingei altogether. And I think most broadly speaking, this colonialist ideology, this set of inflections surrounding Mingei, really aligned with the notion of Asia is one. That was heard again and again and again during imperial Japan to justify invading so much of East Asia. Asia is one in terms of, for East Asia at least, shared use of written Chinese characters, Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism. So, yeah, strikingly, if for visitors to the Japan Folkcraft Museum, There's a continuation of the ahistorical attitude that Yanagi so famously put forth, this notion that one doesn't need to know the provenance of objects. Yanagi famously suggested that what mattered the most was direct perception, a Japanese notion called chokkan. And so even today, if one goes to the Mingenkan, there's very little didactic text explaining the some of the basics, the geographic origins of objects. So we see a perpetual and I think very problematic continuation of some of this colonialist discourse. And some of the colonialist discourse, it involves political issues that are at the forefront of a lot of what's happening today in places like Okinawa, where there's something like 30,000 U.S. troops. So the late 20th century history of Okinawa is equally imbricated in other sorts of, we might say, American imperialist ideologies.
I want to carry on the idea of Asian in one, and I think you, Megan, mentioned this. So when I look at my research materials, I found this kind of difference between the Asian in one's idea circulated by the Japanese government, which is more like a military strategy to gather all different people, like from different culture, like presenting Taiwanese as part of Japanese culture. But in Menge movement, in detail materials, maybe is more obscure in Menge's materials after 1937, when actually we entered to the World War II earlier, and it happened in 1937, and the war between Japan and China started. So it's a kind of, Yanagi still try to emphasize the Menge movement is for local materials, which is based on local diversities. So he kind of emphasized like culture in Okinawa is different from the culture in Tokyo or other places. And he did the same to say Taiwanese craft has a very special status that different from other places. And he emphasized that craft is based on the local materials, local natural characteristics, and local techniques. So I think there's a little difference between that how Menge developed in Taiwan, but people usually think that present a kind of colonial culture that kind to identify Taiwanese craft as a part of Japanese culture. I think in the case of Yan Shuilong, we found very interesting sources that when the Folklore Taiwan magazine published, they try to preserve Taiwan's culture as kind of local identity. It's more like they find a gap between the local practice and the governmental policy to represent Taiwan as a part of Japanese culture. So after, I think it's more obvious in 1960s when the Japanese emperor they tried to emphasize Taiwanese culture as a part of Japanese, and they kind of embrace the diversity in Taiwan. And those local intelligent people, the local elites, we call elites, and they try to say, oh, if that's our purpose to present local culture as a part of Japanese culture, and why not just present Taiwan as they are? So people kind of navigate a kind of gap between the government imagination of Japaneseness and kind of represent in the kind of local Japaneseness in Taiwan, and to preserve a lot of Taiwanese technique and materials. And I think Yan developed those design and try to manipulating the policy a little bit to create local identity by making local materials.
Please join me in thanking our presenters.
Welcome back, everyone. Hi, welcome back. So, moving on to our next panel. Here we go. I am going to have one of the graduate research fellows on this project introduce the next speakers, and I'll hand it over to you, Daria.
Hello, everyone. Paul Sturton was educated at the universities of Edinburgh and Glasgow and at the Courtauld University of Art. He is Professor Emeritus at Bard Graduate Center and editor of West 86th, a journal of decorative arts, design history, and material culture. He was one of the team of scholars responsible for the British Council-funded project, Britain and Hungary, Contacts in Art, Architecture, and Design, and contributor to the 3-volume publication. He has written many books and exhibition catalogs, the most recent being Jan Tschichold and the New Typography, published by BGC and Yale University Press in 2019. Thank you.
Thank you, Daria. So, on the 10th of October 1900, the English artist-designer Walter Crane arrived at the Budapest main railway station to be met by a large deputation of the directors of the principal museums and art schools. As he later wrote, déjeuners, banquets, receptions and entertainments followed thick and fast. The reason for this enthusiastic welcome was a retrospective exhibition of over 600 works by Crane in the Iparmuvezeti Museum, the National Decorative Arts Museum, modelled very much on the V&A in London. Now, by this time, Crane was known for more than the children's book illustrations that had made his reputation in the 1870s. Not only had he embraced socialism, by this date he'd also been appointed to some of the leading positions in the arts and crafts. In 1888 he became the founding president of the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society. In 1892 he provided the illustrations to Morris's Kelmscott edition of The Glittering Plain. He was also an active teacher and writer on design, becoming in 1898 the director of the Royal College of Art. In fact, by the time of his visit to Hungary in 1900, Crane could be regarded as the leading figure in the movement and a worthy successor to William Morris himself. The Hungarians certainly felt that they had achieved something of a coup in securing this large exhibition and that they were welcoming a celebrity to their capital. The first evening, there was a grand dinner attended by leading figures from the Hungarian artistic and political world, including 3 government ministers, the Roman Catholic bishop, and a series of other politicians. Remember, this is for a designer. The climax to the evening was a tribute to Crane delivered by Mór Yokai, the leading Hungarian writer, and his speech was reprinted in full the following morning in the Pest newspaper. As he wrote, "We must learn how the Hungarian peasant cloaks, flower-decorated trunks, dishes, cups must be transformed into ornaments fit to embellish drawing rooms, palaces, altars. We must learn how to transform into a creating power the aesthetical sense and artistic inclination of our people." What we might conclude from this is that contemporary crafts were deeply entangled with the so-called folk arts and alongside it the search for a national style, the topics that I'll explore in this talk. Now, Crane went on to elaborate on the status of the folk arts himself in a public lecture entitled On Art and Socialism, where he wrote, "Soul-killing industrial production was destroying folk art, and mass production alienated people from their environment. It must be replaced by a collective, unified art Gesamtkunst." Now, after this, Crane and his family set off to Pécs in southern Hungary to visit the Zsolnay factory and then on to Transylvania, which proved to be the most memorable part of his visit. Crane was able to make drawings of village life and the embroideries that they saw in the various peasant houses. And this on the right-hand side is a little ex libris that he prepared for the guide who took him round the various Hungarian villages of Transylvania. Now, Transylvania has a special place in Hungarian self-consciousness or identity. It is the heartland of their traditional culture. In much the same way that the Tatras in the Zakopane region of southern Poland were taken to be a source of pre-industrial Polish identity at a time when the state of Poland did not exist. Transylvania was widely believed to have preserved the spirit of early or pre-Ottoman Magyar culture, since the western parts of the land, especially the area around Buda, had been deliberately devastated by the Turks. This popular view was given substance by arts and crafts designers like Károly Kós, who wrote, and I'm quoting, "Medieval culture was the basis of true Hungarian culture, and only in Transylvania can we find the essence of Hungarian medieval culture. This area, and particularly the Kalotaszeg, the area around Kolozsvár or Cluj, was even christened at that time as the perfect Ruskinian land." Now, this interest in the folk arts of Transylvania was not new, and it certainly wasn't prompted by Crane's visit. Indeed, over the previous 20 years, a series of ethnographers, travellers, collectors, and museum curators had travelled throughout Transylvania, gathering and recording material. What I'm showing you here is a sheet of watercolours by Joseph Huska, a school teacher who began recording peasant designs in woodwork and embroidery in watercolour, which he later used to illustrate his books on the folk arts, such as The Seckler House from the late 1880s. Now, indeed, the so-called Millennial Village at the exhibition of 1896, marking 1,000 years of Hungarian settlement in the Danube Basin, employed peasants in costume to represent Magyarország, in other words, Greater Hungary. This collection formed the basis of the Museum of Ethnology, and 20 years later, the English designer Charles Robert Ashby visited the collection and reported that the exhibition, classified as handicraft, was particularly instructive, but the special interest lay in the fact that it was still alive. Peasant crafts still actually in existence. I believe that with the possible exception of Russia, Hungary is the only European country where this still obtains. Now, these views of the peasant crafts are not as simple or as straightforward as they might appear. The agent through which much interest in the peasant crafts had been promoted was Mrs. Gyarmati, and she had fostered what was known as házi ipar. Now, házi ipar can be loosely translated as the home industries, often set up with philanthropic aims to relieve rural poverty through the more systematic production of traditional crafts like lace making and embroidery, which were sold through shops in many cities throughout Europe. And that's what you can see here on the left, a display of the peasant crafts, many of which were produced according to patterns and pattern books which were distributed. On the right, indeed, at the National Exhibition of the Kalotaszeg interior, again, it was stocked and staffed by Mrs. Gyarmati's házi ipar craftspeople as an expression of this rural craft tradition. However, Crane's arrival in Budapest coincided with quite profound changes in Hungarian government policy towards the crafts. There was a shift from the home industries, Hazy Ipar, to the arts and crafts exemplified in several institutional developments. There was, of course, the opening of the Ipar Movisetti Museum in 1896 under its first director, Jeno Radicic, who began collecting examples of contemporary design and crafts, not Hazy Ipar. As Juliet Kinchin has pointed out, the transfer of craft policy from the Ministry of Commerce, which closed the home industries in 1899, to the Ministry of Education meant that the art department under Elek Lippic highlighted the role of the professional artist's craftsman and adapted the intellectual framework of the international arts and crafts movement to the particular political and socio-economic context of Hungary. Indeed, Crane's visit and the large exhibition can be seen as part of this policy, rejecting the home industries in favour of named, highly theorised designers. I think this is an interesting point, and it points up one of the real problems with design history, modelled as it is so often on art history around individuals. The anonymous design that surrounds us is rarely analysed in such detail. Now, what Lippic and Radicic began doing was what's been described as an international style offensive, promoting Hungarian craft and design at various international exhibitions. This was Paris 1900. At the same time, the Decorative Arts Association relaunched their journal in 1896 under the name of Magyar Iparművészet. In other words, Hungarian arts and crafts, not Hungarian folk crafts or the like. Now, as Crane observed at the time, at the schools of design, the traditional patterns of the peasant embroideries and the painted decorations of their furniture and pottery were set before the students as models, not just to be copied, but as an inspiration to develop this sense of design. And these really do mark a distinction between home industry and the artist designer. And we have some examples of these pattern sheets that were used to instruct students in the making of furniture. These two are indeed by Ede Torockai Vigond, someone that I'll be coming back to slightly later. Now, what marked out this shift in policy, in direct subsidization of the crafts, was the transfer of the Torontal weaving workshop to the village of Gödöllő, where Aladar Korosfoy Krish was already resident, but he was soon joined by Sándor Nagy, Ede Torockai Vigond, Mariska Undi, Odon Mare, and the others to create a craft community, ostensibly in the country to be closer to traditional peasant culture, not dissimilar to Ashby or Jimson and the Barnsleys, but in fact, Gödöllő is not so distant from Budapest. What this craft community also encouraged was the new culture of health, outdoor life, handmade clothing, nude bathing, and combined nurseries for all the children. Many of the ideas that were already quite popular amongst the English arts and crafts movement. But this was not an organic growth. These designers were paid to move to Gödöllő, and there was funding for building new houses, such as these, designed by István Megyeszöly. And this is the house of Sándor Nagy and his wife Laura Krish. The interiors and lifestyle exhibiting the ethos of the colony and their collections. Now, what kinds of folk arts were they looking to? Well, one example is in the photographs of plank furniture which Shandor Nodge took and which were much imitated, copied and adapted for urban and rural furniture in this period. But perhaps the most significant part that you can always trace through the Hungarian arts and crafts is the use of Transylvanian grave posts, which you can see in the drawing on your left, which reappears in a host of different forms. In the centre is the so-called fairy tale suite of furniture by Torockoi Vigond, or on the right, the end of a church pew by Károly Kós, adapting these various forms. Now, the Gödöllő community fared very well under the new government policy, but they did have philanthropic applications. Vigond designed a series of small houses, schools and community centres that were built in villages throughout Transylvania. He also developed a very distinctive drawing style, which many of the Hungarian craft designers echoed, which I will come back to very briefly. This one on the left-hand side is a community centre. On the right is an artist's house, which was actually built, and you can see the version of it there. Now, you can see this blending of traditional peasant crafts and modern artist craft productions in this interior by Vigond from 1914, incorporating elements of his own design work with peasant embroideries and flask ceramics from Korund. Now, as I suggested, Gödöllő was heavily influenced and indeed supported by government departments. It was given very favourable treatment under the government policy of Lippisch and Radisic. For example, it was the Gödöllő designers who put together the exhibition for the Louisiana Purchase exhibition of 1904, which you can see here, various views of it. The mural, or the great gateway into the main exhibition area, was by Krisch. And not only that, which is a temporary piece, the Gödöllő designers were given the commission to design the interior of the somewhat pompous imperial baroque exterior of the Liszt Academy. When you go inside, it's a total contrast to the rather traditional forms outside of it. Or indeed, of the massive Marosvásárhely Palace of Culture, which takes up the equivalent of a New York block. And the interior was again painted, sculpted, and indeed decorated with stained glass by the Gödöllő artists. Now, by 1908, a new generation of arts and crafts designers were emerging, many of whom had participated in another ambitious artistic and anthropological or proto-anthropological study. This was Dezső Malonyai's 5-volume Art of the Hungarian People, again with great emphasis on Transylvania. And you can see in the centre one of their main focal points, the Torockoi Calvinist Church, which Krisch christened as Our Mount Fuji. This, alongside it, is the cover of Ahaz by Károly Kós. And Kós emerged from a group known as the Fiatalok, the young ones. They graduated from architecture and design school in 1907 and immediately went on, produced this journal and a range of other decorative works. Indeed, they took up that distinctive drawing style that Krisch and Vigond had promoted earlier, and all of the Fiatalock were particularly good graphic artists, producing lino cuts, woodcuts, and a range of other printed material. The Fiatalock also received considerable support. In 1909, just 2 years out of college, aged only 27, Károly Kós was given the commission to design the buildings for the Budapest Zoo, which you can see at the top, that's the birdhouse. Also, an entire housing estate at the edge of Budapest at Veckerle, which you can see at the bottom. But not content with that, he also designed the same year a church at Zebegenyi, 2 schools in Budapest, and a museum in Transylvania. I repeat, he's 27 years old with 2 years' experience. Given the scale of these projects, this arts and crafts version of Transylvanian peasant arts could almost be regarded as a national style in the years leading up to the First World War. It was certainly perceived to express the sense of cultural distinctiveness equivalent to the distinctive Hungarian language. But this is deeply entangled with the politics of nationalism and ethnic identity. There was, as Crane recognised in his talk, widespread discontent among the minorities in the Habsburg Empire. The national aspirations to be an independent country were still ardent, he writes, and the memories of the old struggles and patriots of 1848 still fresh with many. There seemed a painful consciousness of being overshadowed by Germany and a restlessness under the Austrian Empire. Now, one could have made similar observations in the territories where there were substantial communities of Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, Ruthenes, Croats, Bosnians, indeed any of the minorities who did not enjoy the privileged position of the Hungarians in the dual monarchy. A central problem in any attempt to establish a national style of design in Central Europe was the fact that all communities were composed of very distinct, mixed ethnic and linguistic groups. And this prompted a lot of debate within Hungary and among the minorities. In that map, which you can see on the right, it's an ethnic map prepared in 1911 from the census of 1910. And the green parts into the centre are the Hungarian speakers. But Hungary controls most of the right-hand side of this map. And already by this date, there were a majority of Wallachians or Vlachs, nowadays Romanians, in Transylvania. That same year, Aladar Korosfoy Krish produced the studio Peasant Art in Austria and Hungary in London. And despite Alois Riegel pointing out that all attempts to establish a national style or ethnic identity through the crafts were pointless, misleading, and if I quote Riegel, also downright scandalous. Nevertheless, Krish felt able to write, "Today it would seem to be impossible to distinguish by any method known to positive science that artistic manifestation and products of the Hungarian genius from those of other nations." This is just a disclaimer, because he then goes on to say, "And yet, every one of us who travels through the country with open eyes feels convinced that there is a Hungarian national style, however much it may be furrowed and intersected by influences derived from other sources." Now, that may have been his initial take on it, but it was particularly problematic just a few years later when Hungary and Austria were dismembered all on the basis of a plebiscite and a vote. And indeed, what emerged from that was that all of Transylvania was ceded to Romania. Much of the areas of Slovakia and the north were ceded to create Czechoslovakia, and so on. These images I took from a Hungarian propaganda publication, which was to persuade the English that this is what could happen to them if they were treated the same way as the Hungarians were by the peace treaties of 1919 and 1920. Now, but while the Hungarians believed that they were suddenly mistreated and that their cultural and ethnic identity was compromised, it was a liberation for certain groups, notably in Slovakia, where Dusan Jurkovic, who'd received no support or financial subsidy from the Hungarian-led government, was now able to produce a much wider range of work. Now, this debate about the folk arts carries on, and it becomes yet murkier and actually more corrupt as we move into the 1920s. Oh, I'm not sure what happened there. I'm sorry about that. It was begun actually by the great French art historian Henri Faucillon when he wrote of at the first Congress on folk arts under the auspices of the League of Nations. He claimed to reject nationalist or ethnic determinism, but as I've said, this is usually a disclaimer that precedes the author making nationalist or ethnic value judgments. One of my students once pointed out it's like the English saying to you, I don't mean to be rude, because you know that an insult is coming next. Therefore, when Oprescu, who was Faucillon's protege, proposes that present art is a gauge of artistic creativity, unrelated to intellectual achievement, Oprescu says, it's true, we cannot identify different ethnic groups through their folk arts. But he then goes on to isolate a descriptive or naturalistic tendency in Hungarian peasant art, which he associated with sources in the East, as opposed to an abstract tendency among the Romanians, which was, and again I quote, a function of the mind more given to abstraction. I chose these pictures, which are now rather corrupted and turned sideways, but they're all Oprescu's selection of Transylvanian folk arts, which prove his view that the Romanians had a tendency towards abstraction. Now, writing this in 1929, he is essentially aligning the Romanian mindset with abstraction, which was, of course, one of the dominant fine art forms of the period. Now, it's at this time Károly Kós had chosen to remain in Transylvania under Romanian rule. He was born in Transylvania, he had lived there, and he felt it was his duty to remain with the beleaguered Hungarian community in Transylvania, to try and foster and develop arts and crafts and other cultural organisations. But there's a certain sadness about this in 1923 when he wanted to found the so-called Guild of Handicraft on the English model. But in the statement, as you can see, he starts off with, someone may ask, why are you telling us all this? Don't you realise it's 1923, that we're in Transylvania and we have neither a Ruskin nor a Morris nor an Ashby, and our people are not English? Nor do we have anonymous patrons who are able to dedicate large sums of money to communal purposes, work cooperatives, or to artistic goals in general. Kós's sad attempts to develop this cultural form really find their best expression in his books and prints of vernacular buildings. This one from Erdei Kové, translated as The Stones of Transylvania, as an echo of Ruskin's Stones of Venice. But In the long tail to Koch's career, there would be no commissions for buildings, furniture, or interiors, such as those he had received before 1914. Koch died in 1977, a rather grizzled 93-year-old, by which time his younger followers had turned their attention to a new movement, that of organic architecture, led by Imre Makowitz. Now, like the arts and crafts movement, organic architecture sought to inspire an indigenous spirit of Hungary through the adaptation of vernacular forms and the revival of traditional craft skills. Also, like the arts and crafts, it quickly became politicized in the environment of late communism. Even after 1989, it was closely aligned to the Christian right. There is a direct link between these two movements at the opposite ends of the 20th century, but I'll leave you to think about that. Thank you.
Sohee Ruk is a PhD candidate in history at Columbia University. She is a historian of the Soviet Union with an emphasis on Central Asia and the Caucasus. Her research interests encompass commodities, material culture, business history, and making. She is currently working on her doctoral dissertation, Weaving Oriental Carpets into the Soviet Union, which examines how the craft of carpet weaving in the Caucasus and Central Asia entered the vocabulary of the Soviet state. Her research has been funded by Gerda Hunkel Stiftung, the Winterthur Museum, Garden and Library, and the Harriman Institute. Welcome, Sohee.
So as a historian, this is a rare and exciting opportunity to speak with a group of art historians and people that are interested in craft and in material culture for me. So the arts and crafts movement, as we've seen, viewed from the perspective of its British creators, was a challenge against the fragmentation of labor in favor of a holistic view of artistic production. In the Russian case, scholars such as Wendy Salmond and Alison Hilton have showed how the arts and craft movement in late imperial Russia presented itself in the form of vernacular folk revival of peasant handicrafts in the service of a distinctly Russian style rooted in village folkways, such as ones that were being negotiated in the Abramtsevo workshops in the outskirts of Moscow that nonetheless operated with a hierarchy of design and craft. My presentation aims to extend our gaze past central Russia to broaden out our scope to the peripheries of the Russian Empire. This paper traces the reverberations of the arts and crafts movement in Russian Transcaucasia using the figure Julius Straumann. Straumann's trajectory is particularly emblematic of networks of empire. Born in Druviana Volust, part of the Livland province of the Russian Empire, he received his artistic education in St. Petersburg from the Stieglitz School of Drawing. After a stint in Paris, after graduating, Straumann returned to Russia and later found a job in Tiflis in the Caucasus, where he worked closely supervising the artistic elements of the carpet industry in the region, in the southern and eastern parts of the Caucasus. In 1923, after the Sovietization of the region, he returned to Latvia and was instrumental figure in the folk textiles world in Latvia. Straumann started his career in government, but quickly decided to change careers to become an artist. He applied to the Baron Stieglitz School of Drawing in St. Petersburg in 1898. The Stieglitz School was one of several institutions in industrial art in the Russian Empire that aimed to prepare its students for careers in industry. The curriculum for the school in the 1880s to the 1900s included not only foundational courses in drawing, but also specialized courses in various mediums of industrial art, including maiolica, pattern drawing for woven and printed fabrics, porcelain painting, lace, and embroidery. Straumann finished a full course of studies in December 1904, and his own artistic education included classes in various decorative arts, including maiolica and printed textiles. These are some of Straume's works from his time in Petersburg and in Paris that show in textiles that show a distinctly Art Nouveau influence. And during his studies, upon finishing, I'm sorry, I apologize for the blurry images. I don't know what happened in the rendering. During his studies, upon finishing an exam in 1902 in drawing for textiles, Straume was presented with a prize in the form of the latest in carpet scholarship. The book, published in 1891 as Oriental Carpets, Orientalische Teppiche, was a sequel to the 1877 volume of Oriental Carpets by Julius Lessing, the director of the Kunstgewerbe Museum in Berlin. Lessing's 1877 volume was largely influential in the field for the methodology of using Renaissance-era paintings to reconstruct classical carpet patterns. Lessing's 1891 volume, that Straume had received, however, consisted of high-quality lithographs of notable carpets in the Berlin Museum's collections. A rising interest in carpets, a rising interest in collecting old carpets from Europe's museums, some of the people involved included William Morris, reflected a change in approach from paintings to actual carpets to examine various patterns and structures. This is also the approach taken by the 3-volume book on Oriental carpets by the Handelsmuseum in Austria, pictured to the right. Straume arrived in Tiflis in 1907, and according to his biographer, Laima Klavina, Straume did not initially wish to live in the Caucasus at first, but needed to take the job as he had no other job prospects. He was hired as the first artist for the Caucasus Handicrafts Committee, an organization established in 1899 by the Ministry of Agriculture and State Domains of the Russian Empire that aimed to improve conditions for handicrafts and handicraftspeople, or kusari, in the Caucasus. One of the most chief concerns of the organization was the carpet handicraft due to its outsized importance in the local economy. By hiring Straume, the committee could intervene artistically into carpet weaving. The Caucasus Handicraft Committee was part of a broader interest in reviving peasant handicrafts in the Russian Empire in the late 19th century. Various workshops on peasant handicrafts was organized by wealthy philanthropists, institutions of local self-government, the Zemstva, or the Ministry of Agriculture. Those in the Caucasus often remarked on the relative lack of attention paid to the handicrafts of the region compared to Central Russia, where sustained work on peasant handicraft had been ongoing since the 1880s or in the 1990s. The activities of these handicraft-focused organizations included not only intervention in the form of design instruction or workshops, but also the marketing of finished products, which included the exhibition of goods. The slides here include photographs taken by Straume of goods of handicraft kustar manufacture from the other parts of the Russian Empire. The goods here are from the Moscow Zemstva workshop, and the photo is possibly from the 1913 second All-Russian exhibition of handicrafts. And the top picture on the right is a picture of a exhibition of handicrafts in Temirhanshura in Dagestan. Interventions in the handicrafts in the peripheries of empire, however, also included another layer of difficulties. Numerous reports from the Caucasus Committee highlighted the insularity of Muslim women as an obstacle. An attempt to set up a workshop for carpet weaving in Kasumkent in Dagestan, for example, was abandoned in 1909 because of the difficulties in attracting women and girls, despite the high wages that the workshop offered. Instead, the workshop was moved to Akhti, also in Dagestan, which had a more Russified population. In Shusha, in Karabakh, the workshop, which had been moved to the Tatar, now Azerbaijani, part of the town, also had difficulties attracting students because the instructor, a graduate of the weaving and dyeing workshop in Vyshny Volochyok in central Russia, did not speak the local language. There were attempts to find an assistant instructor, a Muslim woman knowing the local Tatar language, who could serve as an interlocutor, which was for a long time unsuccessful. What did artistic intervention, however, mean in terms of the carpet craft? While acquainting himself with the state of the carpet handicraft, Straume reflected on what he saw as an unfortunate state of affairs among the handicrafts people. The loss of a valuable older carpet design tradition that had been tainted by modernity. Older carpets with beautiful patterns were no longer left in the region as they had been sold abroad by merchants. Although some older specimens remained in the possession of a few private individuals and in some mosques, the average weaver was left devoid of good examples to draw on. Straume noted that even though the carpets he saw were made with impeccable technique, the carpets he saw were in a deplorable state in terms of design. Especially egregious were carpets with depictions of crimson roses and light leaves, carpets that featured the likeness of dogs and cats, landscapes, and even full scenes from village life. Many patterns were taken from albums for embroidery, copied from textiles made in the mills of Europe or Russia, or even, as Straume noted in one case, from designs from soap packages. And so carpets such as these, with depictions of horses and dogs, rendered in a hyper-realistic style, made in the early 1900s, would have been considered part of the problem by people such as Straume. It was up to artists like Straume to intervene with more acceptable designs. Straume's job consisted of collecting marketable designs from older carpets and working out patterns based on their pictures. The carpet patterns were made by hand on large sheets of graph paper. This is an example of such a pattern. The scale of these patterns were immense, and these patterns were meant to be passed around and used. What appears to be a horizontal crease in the pattern is actually a cut, where the two halves have been pasted onto a woven textile, as can be seen in this photo on the right that depicts the backside. It is likely that the reinforcement happened after the pattern had become damaged from having been folded multiple times. The patterns made this way were almost exclusively used in the carpet workshops of the Handicrafts Committee. The patterns feature a color bar on the bottom. This would indicate the different colored yarn that was needed to recreate the composition in carpet form. The photo to the right depicts a photograph of the Caucasus Handicrafts Committee workshop in Akhti in Dagestan, which employed lesbian girls sitting in front of wooden vertical looms. The prototypes of the looms were also made by the committee. In the loom on the right, a paper pattern is wrapped around one of the vertical beams, the heddle rod, and the creases and wear from use are also visible. I want to now dive into the process of creating these patterns and the role of the artist in this process. I'm also hoping that a sustained discussion of the process will open up broader conversations about the role of the artist designer that would resonate with this group of scholars. The making of the pattern started off with identifying photographs of notable carpets to be copied. Starting in 1908, Straume traveled to regions, Karabakh, Dagestan, Kuba, and other parts of the Caucasus that had strong carpet weaving traditions. The carpets that Straume was after were those with patterns that were distinctly Caucasian, carpets with geometric or stylized floral motifs that were free from the pernicious influences that Straume described above. These are some black and white photographs that Straume took from 1809 to sometime in the 1910s. The carpets are identified mostly by the region in which they were found, but in other parts of the archive, some of the carpets were associated with a more definite provenance. The names of villages in which they were found, or the names of the trader or the owner to which the carpet belonged. The carpets were usually not photographed in full, but rather a portion. Either a half or a quarter of the carpet is usually visible. The black and white photographs of carpets would then be manipulated. The photographs would be enlarged with a focus on pattern of the carpet. In Straume's personal archive in Latvia, in the Latvian State Archive, there are multiple enlarged photographs in which the outlines of various patterns are traced by hand. It's a little blurry to see, but I promise you that there are traces that of pencil marks that have traced the patterns in the picture on the right. Then the photos would be converted to colored drawings. The drawings are overlaid onto an enlarged photograph that we saw earlier, and the patterns would be traced and filled in with color. This is another example. This particular carpet is labeled as palas, which is a kind of flat woven carpet using plain weave, and you can actually see some of the weave in the white sections. I've not yet seen the original photograph, but the carpet may still be a palas, but with some weft wrapping technique to make some more complex patterns. The drawing itself is signed and dated by Straume to the year 1911. The carpet is indicated as being from the village of Kris of Kuba Uyest, Baku Gubernia. The size of the carpet is also indicated. 2 arshins and 1 vershok by 3 arshin and 4 vershok with a density of 16 by 16 knots per unit. And then the photographed carpets would be turned into a design by transposing them onto graph paper. The process seemed to involve an initial pencil sketch that would outline the various motifs in pencil and then filling in the outlines with color paint, as this photograph demonstrates. The progression shown in these next 2 slides demonstrate how the carpet is rendered into a design. This particular carpet is a sumach, which is another type of flat weave that uses weft dropping. And a copy of the original photograph is on the left, and you can see here the carpet in more of its material form with the fringe on the bottom. And on the right is the enlarged photograph of the same carpet that emphasizes the pattern. The cropping of the photograph also manipulates the photograph to emphasize the symmetry of design. I want to call your attention to where the photograph on the right cuts off right in the middle, bisecting the design motifs in half. The little crab-like design on the top left corner disappears here, but it will later appear in the next set of slides. Then the carpet is rendered into design, perhaps with an intermediary step of the colored paintings that emerge on top of the enlarged photographs. I've previously called attention to the crab-like design, which again appears here in the form of a pattern. The motifs and patterns are transfigured onto a grid, with each grid square denoting a single knot that provides a roadmap for the weaver. The pattern itself could be extended using principles of symmetry in either direction to form different dimensions. Now here is where things get a little murky, that I'm still trying to make sense of. In Straume's personal archives, there are smaller sketches of carpet ornaments depicted in part. It seems likely that these ornaments were traced from photographs, especially taking into account that half or a portion or a corner of the motifs are depicted, and see, for example, some of the more shakier attempts on the second image to mirror in freehand corresponding ornaments. Straume's co-worker at the Caucasus Handicrafts Committee, David Tsitsichvili, who started working in the committee in the 1920s, characterized Straume's first encounter with carpets in the following way. Quote, "The first works of the young artist, Straume, imbued with the aesthetic influences of the West, showed that he was simply bewildered by the vast wealth of ornaments of Caucasian carpets." End quote. Straume needed to familiarize himself with the particularities of carpet weaving in each region, how carpets were woven, which materials were used, and of course, the varied ornaments themselves. The orientalizing language aside, tracing seems to be a way that Straume familiarized himself with the ornament. Furthermore, there also seems to be some element of grid-like thinking that was also part of the process. The left image is a sketch of what looks to be a portion of a carpet from Straume's archive, and overlaid on top of the image is a numbered grid that divides the carpet into gridded sections, which is numbered sequentially, from 0 to 37 vertically and 0 to 17 horizontally. The image to the right, although it is not a corresponding pattern or carpet, is a carpet pattern. A close-up look at the grid on the pattern shows a bolded line every 8 grids. The bolded line that is also numbered sequentially in this pattern. It is not hard to imagine how this system could help transfer the picture into a pattern. And finally, I wanted to touch on the dissemination of patterns through publishing, which was attempted for the first and last time by the committee in 1913. The publication of patterns was to facilitate broader distribution. As I discussed earlier, the patterns were made by hand and hence could only be used within the workshops of the committee. There was also mention of the need for Straume to continuously remake the patterns as they became damaged with use. Publication was a way to solve this issue, and the album here, pictured here, published 5 examples of exemplary Caucasian carpets for execution for handicraftspeople. The model for the patterns all came from existing carpets, as this album makes clear. And the following slides will demonstrate how the transformations happened as the existing actual carpet became rendered into design. One of the carpet designs published in the photo is that of a carpet that is marked as a rare old carpet, more than 100 years old, from a mosque in the village of Akhti in Dagestan Oblast. This photograph of the carpet depicts it with frayed edges and damages to the top, which even in its rendition into a colored drawing, which again is transfixed on top of a photograph, is smoothed out. Instead of frayed yarn and missing pieces, the border is reshaped into a perfected form. Before moving on to the next slide, I want to direct your attention to the top right corner of the border pattern in both of these images. The border is made up of replications of a single arrangement of ornaments, which in the corner has met some irregularities where it stops and starts back up again. These two images are the carpet rendered into a form of a drawing without the photograph underneath, and into a pattern that was published in 1913. The corner here appears in a perfected form. It is now symmetrical along a diagonal axis. Rendering the drawing into a pattern, some motifs are edited out while others are included. It's a little hard to see here, but there's a one white motif that was added in using principles of symmetry, but is absent from the original carpet or the drawings. Just to conclude, my focus on Strame here in this presentation was not so much to singularly shed a focus on the artist himself. Rather, Strame was embedded into the networks of empire, craft initiatives, and art education. More importantly, delving into the various process through which carpet design was created, through a process of replicating, copying, and perfecting, also calls into question the singularity of the artist and authorship. And finally, to tie this together with the theme of the session, carpets denoted as examples of an orientalizing craft did not figure into discussions of national style in the Russian Empire. Their incorporation into national narratives would come later in the Soviet period as the states states emerged under the auspices of the Soviet state in the Caucasus, in the states of Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. Thank you.
Michal Borzinski completed comparative studies on literature and visual arts at Jagiellonian University in Krakow in 2010. Was also educated in Masaryk University in Brno and defended his doctoral thesis at the University of Warsaw in 2016. He is awarded with grants and scholarships for scientific stays in Paris, Bratislava, Budapest, Martin, and Lviv, and cooperated with or lectured in some institutions in Poland and Slovakia. As curator in the Mazovian Museum in Plock from 2016 to 2019, and the Silesian Museum in Katowice since 2019, he has prepared several exhibitions of art and design. His investigations are devoted to Central European phenomena of modernism and contemporary years, as explored mostly from international and intersemiotic perspectives. Welcome, Michal.
Dear Antonia, thank you very, very much for the invitation. Dear sirs and madams, I wish you a pleasant journey. The reception of practices affiliated with the arts and crafts movement in the achievements of Polish, Czech, Slovak, and Hungarian cultural circles has a long tradition dating back to the late 19th century. Central Europeans drew on them directly or indirectly, resulting in original ventures in the interwar period too. Later, during the communist captivity in the region situated so much between the West and the East, the principles borrowed from the Britons were rather used for propaganda goals, while the free creative energy from outside the official circuit could not count on too many admirers and buyers in the general marasmus and poverty. The essence of the paper is to highlight the echoes of the arts and crafts legacy in the activities of several contemporary artists in the transformed era. Usually, they do not speak about such influence, becoming their British successors preferably in the eyes of the critic, although they carry out a numerous of postulates even programmatically. Close contact with nature and national or narrower localness intertwined with personal or collective identity, then pietistic approach to material and precision workmanship and individualization of the object. Today's world of design, with its multidirectional meanders, may be characterized by a strong inclination of performers towards all sorts of experiment too. In the currents of naturalism and organicism, intrinsic to decorative poetics, pre-Raphaelitism, and so on, the dynamics of evolution are determined by the ambitious projects with a discursive or philosophical tinge, such as the vases of the unabashed, playing with pop culture Czech designer Maxim Belchovsky. In a somewhat maximalist manner, he decided to grasp in a solid state of matter for the consistency of snow, collected for 3 years in several places for the purpose of special ceramic casting, with the idea of crystallizing the essence of water itself, which passes by elusively, inexorably. A peculiar multiplication of being is also accomplished within silver jewelry pieces and tableware accessories executed by Przemysław Wańczyk, who, with the need for his own technological solutions, managed to retain, or perhaps to clone, the tree branches that he found at the foot of his home Tatras, the most sentimental mountains for a huge number of Poles, full of sublimity and vernacular cultural contexts. Parallel to those artists who excel in caring for nature by environmentalism, recycling or upcycling, Cyril Zakrzewski walks in the path of extolling the nature in a still romantic mode by realizing sophisticated furniture, as if gazing at the branches and boughs of stately trees, from which he would like to draw all the mysterious beauty and strength to introduce them into the living, so often coldly arranged space of a new civilized man, so busy and lonely in the frenzy of everyday duties. The artist and artisan in one person, who settles on the sidelines in the small village Suchelas, like William Morris, a long time ago, this unwritten hair of Henry van der Velde or Eugène Gaillard, reigns alone over the entire demanding and time-consuming process of creation. It culminates in the magnificent universal organicism. It is, though, constantly linked with the whisper of the Polish genius loci due to the choice of birch plywood produced from the source truly typical of the local forest coverage. A similar statement in the medium of porcelain is Bogdan Kosak's Sumin dinner set, marked uniquely by the intended iron filings in its substance and by the meticulously polished, again time-consuming protuberances reminding flowing floral lines on the surface of unpretentious monochromatic vessels. It looks like a little bit of Far Eastern provenance, and furthermore, it appears to contain reminiscence of the late secessionist vases by the German ceramist Max Leuker. But already one word, Sumin, brings on the telling semantic signum of each piece of the service, with its name identical to the name of the locality where the artist was born, and probably with his memories of childhood. The cosmopolitic turns into the unusual, unrepeatable, or it assists other factors in doing so throughout the user's perception of the distinguished handmade goods as accessible to a wide range of society for astoundingly low prices in accordance to the artist's ethics. Cultural attitudes towards localness rely upon the imperative to express and emanate one's creative alterity before and for their countrymen, and frequently among the broader public, including foreigners. The aim is to visualize the vibrancy of one's own differentia specifica, then to develop their language of aesthetics in the real time, admittedly with the possibility of its modifications, but rather in a strong grounding in the founding past. For the purposes of the theory of today's design, in the perspective of the 19th century arts and crafts ideals, I propose to use four concepts: regiophilia, ethnophilia, artiphilia, and historiophilia, that contain an amount of convergences in terms of the centripetal cultural forces standing behind them, although they also show the ontological and often ontic divergences of the phenomena observed. One of the most charming areas of southern Poland, Kraków-Częstochowa upland, called shortly Jura, as having been shaped by ancient geological shifts and medieval political borders, is a rare example of the birth, absolutely from scratch, of a new visual identity in recent decades. It has been long waiting for the sensibility of artists who have finally awakened to discover the richness of Jurassic landscape, botanical, and faunal qualities. It's not about Steven Spielberg, of course. The extraordinary aftermath of karst-forming processes, such as the caves with intriguing floatstone coverings and the rocky outcrops everywhere round there, is reflected in the woolen textiles woven by Jadwiga Wosik, doyenne of Częstochowa's artistic community, and in some works stitched by Elżbieta Chodorowska, who subjects her canvas to local atmospheric conditions that make the colors of the fragmentary folded structures of her compositions cognate with the features of limestone rocks and ruins of castles. The repertoire of Polish Jurassic design motifs consists of ammonites and especially ferns growing in Ewa Gliwa-Kawecka's golden green wall ceramics into a kind of manifesto for the invoked expanse of wilderness, sending the viewer to the untamed, up till mythical corners of the local groves. We are talking about a one-off work of art, as if a prototype, which together with Jolanta Madej's bowls could be, after all, inscribed even in raw, minimalist or loft-like home and public interiors successfully. Not far from the fern falls the coal. In the neighborhood of Jura stretches the post-industrial district of Upper Silesia, formerly with the great natural resources, dozens of mines, steel mills, and smoking chimneys. Its illustrious mining traditions, determined by the history of the land and the self-awareness of its inhabitants, now seem to give precedence to a thriving identity-forming activities in the fields of literature, film, and visual arts. Design lovers, meanwhile, are attracted by the increasingly favored women's and men's jewelry of an almost symbolic character, made of the local natural material, processed by Roma Skuza and Bogna Polańska, among others, like a semi-precious stone transformed into a cut diamond. This is how goldsmithing axiology and the conventional view of the bullion are radically revised. The valuable and rewarding is seen not in what shimmers in all its glory, as the fruit of raw material metamorphosis, but ultimately in what constitutes a return to the beginning of these processes, and at the same time to the actual layers of the real and mental landscape of Upper Silesian regiophilia. In the same Katowice in question, apparently on the global wave of fashion for folklore, sometimes laced with variations of pop art, germinated the idea of creating a carpet based on the well-known folk art cutout cultivated in Łowicz and Kurpie, small areas of the Mazowian province in central Poland. Magdalena Lubińska and Michał Kopaniszyn's Moho Heidia, made of wool bears in larger and lesser sizes and in a selection of vivid colors, was appreciated immediately abroad on the pages of the wallpaper and the Sunday Times magazines. Exhibited in Milan or Paris in 2008, it received the Red Dot Design Award as the first ever Polish product. The carpet's great success lies in its perfectly balanced, centralized contours related to the rigors of folk geometrization and rhythmization, as well as in its folk saturated colors. Nonetheless, the aspects of the relationship between arts and business, of the whole marketing machine, are permanently crucial, especially in the light of those talented but introverted or creation focused people who are simply unable to start their way or run in it. Petra Toth and Edyta Gonsior, in turn, with their inviting websites and virtual shops, have succeeded in prolific jewelry immersed in native folklore, as more and more known in their home countries and beyond. The career of the latter female artist, one of so many today, makes evident that a vast catalogue of contemporary forms, based on different sources of inventiveness, from local to exotic, co-occur in a single body of work very often. Still in the tones of ethnophilia, in admiration of the costumes of Polish Carpathian Highlanders, arose the folky earrings, composed of a string of viscose, glass pearls, and beads in the technique of soudage, celebrating themes of popularity. The earrings completed the fashion collection by Larissa Knapp, just as the soudage necklace from the Bazu atelier of Zuzana Barczakova closes the dress by Mishena Juchas, with its pattern that came forth from the very special way of inspiration, her reading of the indigenous fairy tales, and then applied to fabric by the UNESCO-listed blueprint method. When comparing two interesting idioms from the orbit of ethnophilia, that of the major graphic artist Małgorzata Walkosz-Lewandowska and that of the student Ida Rapaiczova, two creative predilections reveal at first glance. Either to the typical folkloric lush and elaborate patterns in the style of black and white horror vacui, or conversely, to purifying the object from any ornamentation in favor of playing with the outlines of individual parts and possible interventions of additional lines, recalling the past ethnic pieces. In the three-dimensional space is a result of contamination or transmutation of specific Kashubian embroideries and the suggestions of William Morris, to whom the designer herself pertains, while the May dress evokes, let it be called, the Adolf Loos syndrome, or the logic of less is more in general. Situating refreshed traditionalism and refreshed avant-gardism side by side in equal rating ought to underscore the insight into the breadth and plurality of the entire imaginarium of the arts and crafts of our time. The evoked modernizing fluctuations come to the fore within the framework of artiphilia, another trend recognizable in the space of self-identity references of contemporary artists to the inheritance of their former compatriots representing all the fields of so-called official or professional arts. Noteworthy in this regard is the limited up to 8 pieces edition of Killing Rugs offered by the Splot, private art producer in Warsaw, who did not forget that the fabrics should find their way into the decor of today's interior arrangements. So the project was commissioned to the acclaimed, skilled in abstraction graphic designer Edgar Bąk. Simultaneously, the producer preserved the weaving cooperative in the town Bobowa in southern Poland, where Agata Król and Danuta Korzeń made the chaos and cosmos killings with the exactitude and nicety to the order of the Silesian Museum in Katowice. In this cross-linking move, the primary focus remains on a sentiment for the opulent tradition and down-to-earth and almost patronage desire to save what has been degraded, all but irreversibly. Indeed, into the view of culturologists looms up some non-artistic background according to the history of Polish tapestries, once an export commodity, when they were expected to accommodate the sign of spiritual liberty of the nation first oppressed under partitions and next predestined to demonstrate his political sovereignty with its pavilion at the 1925 Exposition Universelle in Paris and with the hundreds of awards won right there. The practices of designers make clear that the modernizing fluctuations do not necessarily involve a certain change in the given aesthetic paradigm, and that they happen also in the realm of heterogeneous materials and techniques utilized to articulate a creative act. Simona Janiszowa and Linda Wikowa, as the Stili duo, prepared a series of winsome plates, mugs, and espresso cups, adorned with their personal feelings at large, like the futurists' words in freedom. They emerged in connection with the outstanding output of Ludovic Fula, praising the child-rooted non-figurative art. The porcelain was commissioned by the Slovak National Gallery in Bratislava, not as a gadget for selected policymakers, but for its stores open to all visitors. This fact confirms the growing sense of responsibility of state and local government units, giving the grants and scholarships allocated to the development of domestic design, as well as of art schools and universities with new departments and cultural institutions of various levels and scopes for the multifaceted heritage. Among the strategies of returns to the issues of the persistence of ethnic, national, or state entities, there would be transpire also historiophilia. Regardless of its ambivalent semantic shades in the texts of some humanists, on the ground of design, historiophilia encompasses yet another manifestation of constructive cultural forces, the effects of which, like mnemonic exercises, supports the memory of the collective and may provide with the tacit visual distinction of its members. This applies both to the phenomena set up on an extensive scale and well promoted in the web space, and those which have been pulled out from the underground by the inquisitive researcher. Historiophilia covers the unique silver earrings offered in one piece by the Slovak atelier of Jana Jamborova and Eugen Jambor, as embedded in the forms and technologies from the Great Moravian State in the 8th and 9th centuries. Further archaeological truths deepen the interest in the material culture of the first Slavs, to whom also refer the Czechs, what prove their studios Dracaria and Graciella in Prague. In another capital city, Warsaw, the Błonie brand, reactivated not long ago, released a limited edition of 600 semi-elegant watches in 3-color versions in cooperation with the Historical Foundation of Polish Aviation as a sort of tribute to the heroes of the lesser-known Fighter Squadron 300, the first and the biggest Polish bomber unit in the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. The booklet accompanying the watch explains that the shape of minutes and hours hands refer to hands of the Avro Lancaster bomber altimeter, and the second's hands is shaped like the compass arrow, etc. What turns out significant in facing Ruskin and Morris' thoughts on the subject? The watch was designed by the team of Polish experts, while its manufacture did have to rely on parts produced in Hong Kong by one of the international watchmaking companies. The case brings back the old symptomatic dilemmas or the aporia triggered by demands difficult to reconcile. Native handmade aesthetic crafts and their reachability for people. Viz. If one were to make a single watch on the spot in its entirety, and there are masters capable of doing it in Central Europe, the process could take about 1 year and would cost the buyer $200,000 or more. The current scientific narrative about some delineated tendencies and endeavors is related both to the grassroots initiatives carried on by individuals and to manifold events organized either by multi-generational associations that have existed since the post-war decades or amended guilds foundations such as the New Moon, New Crafts in Warsaw, with its chairwoman Olga Milczyńska, educated in Poland, Denmark, and other countries. Unlimited diversity of excellent proposals as positioned against the ubiquitous, expressionless trumpery under the banner everything for $1 or $2 takes the lead. The very wish for communal stimulation of arts and crafts and introducing them into a general social life meets a serious accelerating revival of the intentions and enterprise advanced about 150 years ago. Apparently, despite the erupting wars and human rights violations, when looking at the objects discussed and yearning for new arts lovers' houses and for the Gesamtkunstwerk to come true once more, it is quite reasonable to believe in the thresholds of appealing times, unless one estimates that they have just, fortunately, arrived. Thank you for your attention.
I'd like to thank all three of you for very, very interesting talks, but I have a question for Paul. You had discussed a very tenuous and tendentious relationship between folk craft and commercialization in your talk. I was wondering if you could comment more on the effects of that relationship and how government policy was reflecting other political ideals at that same time in that relationship.
Thank you for the question. Well, I'm not sure I should thank you because it's quite a difficult question and a very big topic. What I would say in the terms of the larger picture is that there was a myth among the Hungarians that they were a welcoming, paternalistic group, that they accommodated and tolerated other ethnic groups within the Greater Hungary. That this was not a view shared by the minorities. And yet the Hungarians, it's certainly true that compared to many of the other regions, notably Russia, but also in Germany, the Hungarians had a relatively liberal approach. But it was conditional on the minorities speaking Hungarian and therefore identifying with the folk crafts as their own, although they were specifically Hungarian. So you could say it was an instrument of Hungarianization, of Magyar ország, this larger policy. When we come down to individual details, I think that's more problematic. What we find is, as I was trying to give an indication, is that over several generations, certainly if we think in terms of decades from the 1880s to the 1920s, there's a different twist at each stage in the theorization of the folk arts, but the ultimate aim is to emphasize that Hungarian folk arts have a link to the ethnic Hungarians and that they are justifiably the overlords of their territory. So I mean, my own view on this, which possibly came out, but if it wasn't, I should make it explicit. It is an instrument of power. And it's a form of colonialism that, which, to the Hungarians' annoyance, was turned against them after 1920, when the Romanians, the Slovaks, the Croats all victimized the Hungarians and denied that there was an indigenous Hungarian language of form. So I don't know if that answers your question, Sam, but it's how I think about it. I have a completely cynical view of the way that the folk arts were used.
Great, thank you. Thank you all. I have a question for for both Sohi and Michael, that sort of relates to some of the institutional histories that Paul was bringing up in the context of his talk. Sohi, I noticed that the carpet you showed as this kind of negative example, the thing to be avoided, was itself collected in an institution. And I'm curious, how does your research kind of in your research, how have you sort of tracked the institutional maybe afterlives of both the positive and negative, the design drawings that get instrumentalized in this really specific way and the things that were you're sort of shunned? What is the story there that plays out in the decades following this moment? And kind of inversely, Michael, working with a lot of this contemporary work, how do you, and in the space of this institution, how do you see this work kind of relating to the historic examples that you really beautifully illustrated? How are you drawing out those discourses in the institutional context you work within?
Yeah, no, thank you for the very fun question. So the carpet that I showed here, the image in the carpet itself comes from the museum of the Azerbaijani National Museum of History. There's also numerous other carpets that depict similar horses and dogs and things that would have been considered horrifying to their 20th century observers that were versed in the handicrafts. But the fact that they were left within the region, it basically, and I guess this also comes as a later, more nationalization of the craft that really takes place in the Soviet period. And so these, the institutions of folk art, of national art, start collecting the carpets that were left within the Caucasus. And there's also these competing narratives that happen. Similar carpets like that also appear in a really prominent exhibition in the National Museum of Armenia as representative of their national heritage. And so, but just looking into the records and reading about how these carpets were viewed in the early 20th century, they're just sold for peace, they're not worth anything at all, just as the fashions change and the people that are selling for markets abroad. So it's a really interesting dynamic of how something that was neglected later becomes incorporated into national narratives by later scholars and later museum professionals.
So we decided to create a new collection in the Legacies Museum in Katowice. It is a very, I would say, peculiar institution because of its multidisciplinary departments. So it's much more difficult than in, say, museum or gallery of art and design. And on the other hand, coming back to the late 19th century, we do not want to repeat something that happened in many places around Central Europe. Of course, not in Prague or in Budapest, when the museums of decorative arts or design were funded. So we would like, the point of departure is to collect as much as possible. Of course, what we think is precious, valuable, rewarding, it's excellent, in form, in the technique, technology, and so on and so on. So, yeah, it would be really beautiful after several years or after many decades, when you come back to the beginning of creating the collection, and then you, I hope so, you will say, yeah, it was the best decision, and we did not do anything what happened at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries around.
Thank you both.
But yeah, I wanted to add something more. It's always about financial inconveniences. So there are many, I would say, factors related to such a topic, creating a new collection. And of course, cooperating with artists, designers, and artisans and shops, design centers and so on, is sometimes really difficult. So sometimes, of course, it's wonderful, it's magnificent that this is our aim, of course, of of living or maybe of working. But there are many stories, I would say, entangled with all these processes.
I had a question for Sohi. I was really interested with these drawings because, I mean, they essentially kind of reverse the process of how drawings would have worked in that they start with the objects and then come back to something which notionally can be created, and you showed that they were being used. But the thing is that, I mean, they would still have to be interpreted in that they don't seem to kind of indicate things like the counting of knots, for the designs themselves. And so I'm wondering, how were they put into practice, and also how do they relate to, the sort of surviving examples we actually have of drawings which were made by master artisans and then actually used in workshops?
Could you clarify what drawings you were talking about? The technical, like the
Well, I'm thinking of the sort of technical drawings that do pre-modern technical drawings, from Persian, Turkish-speaking world, where you actually see, parts of carpets that were actually, put into practice, as opposed to this process of kind of starting with a carpet and then gradually kind of turning it into a drawing, which could then be operationalized.
Yeah, no, I have to admit that I don't know as much about that that earlier process of carpet making, although I do know that there's different aspects of replicating the patterns, not just in the pattern of drawing, but also in these like written or spoken forms of where the knots go. And so this is really interesting. That's a really interesting question, because Straume himself, he didn't come in as a carpet weaver. He's coming in from this perspective of this artist educated in these in the art academy, but nonetheless as a newcomer. And so just kind of looking at the patterns that I saw that emerged from this period, the grid lines are very small, and it's almost really hard to see. And especially compared to these like other patterns that emerged later on in the 20th century, they seem very finicky to work with. And so I do think that there must have been some degree of interpretation that must have gone in, but you do see a lot of standardization that happens with the introduction of patterns such as this, that really seem that is most clear, at least for me, in terms of how certain patterns are grouped together with certain borders, and the ways that certain designs are considered standardized or considered pro forma. And so yeah, I'd love to talk more about this at a later point. But thank you.
Well, please join me in thanking the presenters.
Okay, welcome back. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the tour of Sightlines. I'd really like to thank our tour guides, Mary Adeogun, Bob Hewis, and Angela Crenshaw, for those really exciting and interesting conversations that we just had. And I'd like to invite us all as well to keep in mind some of the themes that they shared with us and discussed, some of the approaches of the exhibition, specifically looking at historical objects and trying to imagine present-day connections between those objects and certain ideas that we can draw out of them. I'd like us to keep that in mind for our own conversations as well. Can we think about the types of ideas, ideals, and situations relating to the arts and crafts and our present-day circumstances? We can discuss this more during our discussion period later. For now, I'd like to welcome you to the third session and the last session for today before our discussion, How Shall We Live Then? This session takes its name from unpublished manuscript notes by William Morris, in which he diagnoses the effects of capitalism and starts to speculate and think about imagining a better future, one with integrity and dignity for makers. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah to introduce our speaker.
Hi, everyone. It's been lovely to be here and meet and chat with all of you. Now on to Amanda. Amanda Thompson's research considers craft within a settler colonial context, focusing both on Native American arts as powerful expressions of cultural continuity and resistance, and on the dynamics of its settler consumption, management, and appropriation. She specializes in textile and fiber arts, including dress, quilts, and dolls. Amanda has over 15 years of experience managing collections and exhibitions for museums, including the New York Historical Society, the Museum for African Art, and the Jewish Museum. She currently serves on the board of the Tomahawk Museum, an Indigenous-led institution expanding knowledge of the native cultures and peoples of southern New England. Amanda?
Thank you all for coming back after our break and exhibit tour. Thanks, Antonia, for organizing this and encouraging me to participate in this fascinating convening. I'm looking forward to being in dialogue with you all. So to begin, which one am I doing? There we go. Thank you. On Saturday, March 12, 1960, the board of directors of the newly organized Seminole Tribe of Florida invited special guests, along with the general public, to the dedication and opening of its first new tribal enterprise, the Seminole Arts and Crafts Center in Seminole Oakley Indian Village on the Dania Reservation. Despite a cold, gray start of the day, an estimated 15,000 people attended the opening. Cars packed the parking lot and surrounding streets, and state police directed traffic. Visitors entered through the Seminole Arts and Crafts Center, a custom-designed glass and wood modernist A-frame building evoking the silhouette of Seminole architecture. In its gift shop, a rainbow of Seminole-made clothing featuring horizontal bands of repeating patchwork patterns hung from the racks, and other crafts lined its shelves. At the back, visitors could view a small exhibit on Seminole history and cases displaying historical Seminole jewelry and clothing. Those who paid admission could proceed to the Oakley Indian Village. Oakley, meaning village in Miccosukee, the hereditary language of most Seminoles, recreated a Seminole camp, the matrilineal grouping of dwellings in which Seminoles had historically lived. Under palmetto-thatched chickees, an architecture innovated by the Seminoles uniquely suited to the hot and wet environment of South Florida. Visitors saw Seminole men and women demonstrating craft techniques and other distinctive cultural lifeways. In one, 97-year-old Billy Bowlegs made moccasins and leggings from tanned buckskins. Elsewhere, a woman wove beads on a loom. Nearby, 2 women worked on hand-crank sewing machines, making patchwork garments. Morgan Smith crafted a canoe from a cypress log, while another man carved dolls and spoons for serving sofki, a traditional corn porridge. Anthropologist Ethel Cutler Freeman, who had relationships of over 30 years with some Seminoles, was a special invited guest to the opening and observed, quote, "Every detail had been thought out and carried through by the Seminoles themselves," end quote. In Oakley, the Seminole tribe created a hybrid of 2 historic forms of Seminole economic engagement, the Commercial Indian Village for tourists and the Craft Development Program, managing their representation and marketing of its culture to benefit its tribal members economically. Today, I'm presenting on 3 mid-20th century Florida Native Seminole craft development programs, by which I mean programs managing Seminole production and sale of craft to non-Native people, primarily white settlers, to drive economic development. The Glade Cross Mission, the Seminole Crafts Guild, both started in the 1930s, and Oakley. I do not link these explicitly to the arts and crafts movement, as such programs to improve and market indigenous crafts in North America have more direct historical foundations in the 19th century craft programs of religious missionaries and the federal government's Indian residential schools, working towards the conversion and assimilation of Native Americans in service of settler colonialism's drive to eliminate the native. In fact, the Glade Cross Mission was founded by an Episcopalian missionary, and the Seminole Crafts Guild was first organized by 2 teachers at a reservation school for Seminole children. More broadly, my thinking on craft development is influenced by Akhil Gupta's study on India, post-colonial development, in which he articulates development as a form of Orientalism and imposed governments and domination, extending the dynamics of colonialism. This presentation is based on a chapter of my in-progress dissertation on Florida native Seminole craft in a settler colonial context. In that chapter, I query both how these programs' efforts to control, improve, and market Seminole craft might enact settler colonial dynamics, and how each organization also supported Seminole self-determination and sovereignty while bringing needed income to Seminole people. Today, I present brief histories of each project, highlighting how each, for the sake of marketing crafts to white settlers, attempted to control and improve, in the words of Gupta, Seminole craft. I conclude with the Seminole tribe's Oculi again, arguing for its important legacy in Seminole entrepreneurialism beyond the realm of craft production and sales. Unfortunately, available archives emphasize the work of these programs' non-Seminoles managers rather than Seminoles craft people. I've tried to compensate for this lack by learning from tribal citizens today about their knowledge of these organizations. The Seminole tribe of Florida and the Miccosukee tribe of Indians are the two federally recognized native tribes in Florida, and they share a common ancestry, culture, and history. I use the term Seminole to refer to people and culture before the organization of these two distinct tribes around 1960, and then Seminole or Miccosukee to refer to the people or tribes after 1960. Following the so-called Seminole Wars of the mid-19th century, wherein the US government sought to remove Seminole people from Florida through massacre or forced migration to Indian Territory, which would later become Oklahoma, those Seminoles remaining in Florida took refuge in the watery Big Cypress Swamp and Everglades of southern Florida, which white men found largely impenetrable. In 1906, the state of Florida began systematic drainage of South Florida to enable settlement, the creation of cities and towns, and the development of agribusiness. Drainage devastated Seminole subsistence lifeways, including how they grew crops, the animals they would hunt for hides and food, and how they moved through the land. Seminoles increasingly turned to craft production and tourism to support their families. From as early as 1900, Seminoles sold wooden dolls and other carvings to settlers at trading posts. In 1917, Seminole Willy Willy opened Moosa Isle, a trading post in Miami where tourists could purchase Seminole crafts and pay admission to see Seminoles demonstrating craft making. Soon, multiple white-owned commercial Indian villages opened in Miami and Fort Lauderdale, at which Seminoles would demonstrate and sell crafts during the winter tourist season. Demand was so high that Seminole brothers Corey and William McKinley Osceola managed a network of Seminole craftspeople throughout South Florida to supply the commercial Indian villages. After the Tam-Miami Trail opened in 1928, many Seminoles opened their own commercial Indian villages with souvenir shops along the east-west road running across the Everglades. Seminole people developed many of these crafts specifically to sell outside of their communities, often based on older forms. Men carved miniature tools, animals, dolls, and other figures from the soft cypress wood from which they had historically carved canoes. Women made dolls from the fiber of the palmetto plant native to South Florida and dressed in Seminole fashion, which were produced by the thousands to be sold every season since their creation in the 1920s. Patchwork fashion became visually synonymous with the Seminole, worn and sold by the Seminole women demonstrating in the commercial Indian villages. Through these crafts, Seminoles capitalized on the tourist desire for souvenirs evidencing Seminole cultural distinction and difference. Craft making provided much needed income. Alice John Sweat related that she, quote, was taught that in order to make a living, you have to learn to do this, to make dolls and beadwork, in case you need to fall back on it or something. This is how. We make these things and sell and we have food, end quote. Frances Osceola recognized that when her great-grandmother's sister, Annie Mae Tommy, taught her to make dolls when she was 16, quote, she taught me the skills that helped me support my family for more than 40 years, end quote. Marie Phillips said craft making, quote, was not just a hobby or something that we were supposed to learn, but we had to learn it in order to survive, end quote. In the 1930s, Seminoles were suffering the combined impacts of drainage, dispossession of lands, labor marginalization due to systemic racism and poor English language skills, and the Great Depression. Responding to Seminole economic need, but also hoping to create better relations with Seminoles, agents of the church and the federal government schools founded programs to market Seminole crafts. In 1933, Episcopalian deaconess Harriet Bedell traveled to Florida to speak about her 15 years as a missionary to Native people in Alaska. She visited a commercial Indian village and was horrified that Seminoles involved themselves in tourism. She endeavored to convert Seminoles to other ways. She reopened the Glade Cross Mission in southwestern Florida, just south of the Tam-Miami Trail. After 2 fruitless years of trying to befriend Seminoles, she came up with an idea. She would buy crafts from any Seminole in need. She would then sell them by mail to her extensive correspondents and to tourists who visited the mission. She had participated in such a program during her training at the Whirlwind Mission to the Cheyenne Arapaho people in Oklahoma, and, having spent 15 years as a missionary in Alaska, likely knew of the Sitka Industrial and Training School founded by Presbyterian missionary Sheldon Jackson, which included curriculum in weaving and carving and encouraged students to make items to sell to tourists. Soon, Seminoles willingly came to the mission to sell their crafts and welcomed her into their camps to purchase them. Bedell touted that craft work was used to, quote, make contact for knowing them better and winning them for Christ and his church, end quote. In actuality, Seminoles resisted her efforts at religious conversion, but they did sell her crafts for nearly 30 years. Tribal member Ethel Santiago recalled appreciatively in 1979, quote, we used to sell our crafts through the Episcopalian missionary deaconess Bedell when she would come visit our camp in the Everglades several times a year. This was her way of helping us since we did not leave our camps very often, end quote. Bedell enforced high standards of craft production, which she referred to in the quote I used in the title, it is better to help them help themselves. Institutions like the George Hayes Museum of the American Indian and the Harvard Peabody Museum special ordered Seminole-made items through her because of the quality. Bedell also tightly controlled the design she permitted Seminoles to use, limiting Seminole craft sovereignty. She named 7 patchwork designs as, quote, true Indian designs, and would only sell items featuring those, when in fact patchwork has a vibrant design history and seamstresses pride themselves in creating new designs. Because the mission sold so many crafts, the distinctive aesthetic she enforced now dominates some museum collections and therefore broader perceptions of Seminole arts. Hurricane Donna destroyed the mission house in 1960, ceasing its craft program. Bedell is not widely known by Seminoles and Miccosukes I've spoken to today. Some heard that she helped their mothers or grandmothers by purchasing crafts. Others assume that she must have profited from them. In 2022, Miccosukee filmmaker Montana Cypress released a short horror film called The Red Orchid, set at the Glade Cross Mission, focused on its religious program and not its craft program. Among settlers, though, Bedell is widely revered as a savior of Seminole and Miccosukee crafts and has been sainted within the Episcopalian Church for her work with the Seminoles. The Seminole Crafts Guild was founded at the rural Seminole Brighton Reservation around 1940. Edith and William Bomer, the white married couple employed at the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs, or BIA, Brighton Day School as teacher and housekeeper, which is a role akin to the matron at a residential school or a home economics instructor tasked with converting Seminole hygiene and deportment to that of settler culture. They were approached by a Seminole mother, Tommy Parker. Through her child, a student at the school, she asked the Bomers to sell a doll she made. They sold it to one of the many tourists who came to see the school. Soon, more Seminole women brought crafts to the school for the Bomers to sell. The BIA encouraged its teachers to get involved in craft development to deepen their relationship in tribal communities and further engage older generations and women in BIA initiatives. In 1940, the Bomers contacted the Indian Arts and Crafts Board, or the IACB, a Depression-era federal New Deal program to help Native Americans earn income through craft production and marketing. The IACB helped organize the Seminole Crafts Guild as a cooperative, with Seminole craftspeople as its members and board of directors, and the BIA lent the Bomers as managers with the IACB's advisement. Unfortunately, the extensive correspondence and archives left by the Bomers likely overemphasized their impact on the Guild, while nearly erasing the agency of its Seminole Board of Directors, craft people members, and employees. Two of the Guild's major initiatives were making Seminole fashion attractive to non-Native women consumers and certifying Seminole craft as genuine. White women model Seminole garments in marketing photos, communicating that Seminole designs were not just for Seminole women, but could be fashionably worn by white women.
A price list described its long skirts as, quote, for evening wear, and its short skirts as for street and sports, helping white women imagine how Seminole clothing fit into their wardrobe. The IACB introduced new products featuring patchwork for Seminole seamstresses to make, such as aprons, bedspreads, pillowcases, and purses geared toward white women consumers. The IACB arranged for an editor of Good Housekeeping, a magazine targeted to women, to visit and offer advice on product design. The IACB collection at the National Museum of the American Indian holds a myriad of women's blouse designs produced by Seminole seamstresses, adapting patchwork to changing settler women's fashions. Making Seminole fashion fashionable for white women was a key guild strategy to increase sales. The IACB also designed and trademarked a logo for the Seminole Crafts Guild, which covered goods ranging from canoes to aprons to toys to garments. The Guild integrated it into product labels, exploiting settler confidence in the U.S. government authority to sell Seminole arts. In turn, the label suggested that products sold by Seminole people without the tag of the U.S. government might not be genuine. The labels also included a space for the name of the artists, unusually for the marketing of Native American arts. Today, the makers of many Seminole pieces can be identified thanks solely to these tags. In 1957, the Seminole Tribe of Florida organized to receive federal recognition, establishing, by the terms of U.S. law, the tribe's status as a nation with inherent rights to self-governance, and also giving it access to many federal grants and loan programs. One of the tribe's first business initiatives was Oakley, which I introduced at the start of this presentation. Oakley was built using federal loan funds on the urban Dania Reservation, now known as Hollywood. It determined to provide opportunities for its tribal members on its 3 reservations through 3 priorities of economic development, business training, and employment. Oakley combined 2 historic Seminole economic activities, the Commercial Indian Village and the Craft Development Program, to attain these goals. The tribe purchased the entire inventory of the guild to initially stock Oakley, and the guild membership voted for the guild's dissolution, as they preferred to work for a tribal enterprise. A number of tribal members who had worked at the guild's shop took positions selling crafts or managing the store and craft program at Oakley or in tribal governance. Oakley would purchase well-made crafts from any Seminole tribal member to sell in its shop. It also opened craft workshops at the rural Seminole reservations to train and employ tribal members in making products it thought would be marketable and profitable. Oakley also invested in its sales room. A postcard of the gift shop, purchased around 1968, shows a mural by Oklahoma-based Seminole Nation artist Fred Beaver depicting traditional Seminole life. Most of the products featured are distinctly of Seminole manufacture, but at the center, weavings which appear to be Dene or Navajo hang. Native masks are mounted on the wall, although Seminole is not a masking culture. Seminole dolls mix with what appear to be Hopi or Zuni Katsina dolls. Models of chickies with palmetto dolls acting out domestic scenes, a sort of Seminole dollhouse, sit on the floor. The mixing of popular and expensive arts from other Native cultures meant to affirm the value of Seminole arts. But Oakley wouldn't let other Native arts, other Native cultures dominate the store. Rather, the retail design enhanced its Seminoleness. For instance, in Beaver's mural, the chickie's roofline, the treescape overhead, the overall composition echo the A-frame beams of the shop's ceiling and the dollhouse chickies arrayed on the floor. The repetition of the A-frame chickie form amplifies the Seminoleness of the entire site, while the shop's wood and glass modernist architecture demonstrates that Seminole crafts suited a contemporary setting, such as a settler consumer's home. The Seminole tribe marketed their crafts in sophisticated and complex ways. From its start, Oakley struggled to create economic opportunities for all its tribal members, to attract tourists while representing Seminole culture, and to find money to stay open while managing the interest payments on the federal debt it had incurred to build the craft center. With the downturn in South Florida and the national economy in the late 1970s, and following many years of fiscal losses, the tribe closed Oakley and turned its efforts to contesting its rights to sell tobacco and run bingo and gambling operations on its tribal lands as a sovereign nation. The tribe has reimagined and reopened Oakley many times since. Today, Oakley is in a new location on the Hollywood Reservation where, now a satellite of the tribe's Atatiki Museum, it teaches visitors about Seminole culture. Earlier this year, I spoke to Seminole people working at Oakley who did not really know its history as a craft development program. Rather, there was tremendous pride in it as a Seminole-run attraction educating non-Native people about Seminole culture. More broadly, though, the memories of grandmothers, mothers, and aunts making and selling crafts to care for their families at commercial Indian camps, and perhaps through these craft development programs, are revered. Oakley might be more important within the business history of the tribe. Oakley provided a business education from which the tribe built its casino gambling operations, which has created economic security for the tribe. Through Oakley's struggles, the tribe perhaps realized that the performance of difference necessitated by these programs, marketing Seminole culture to white settlers and its low returns, perpetuated Seminole economic and political marginalization, as benefited the settler colonial state. As tribal chairman James Billy said of the state's resistance to Seminole tribal gaming, quote, "It's funny how the white man never bothered with us as long as we were just selling a bunch of Indians selling trinkets along the side of the road," end quote. Tribal Council Representative Max B. the grand finale. Tribal Council Representative Max B. Osceola recalled on Oakley's 50th anniversary in 2010. When the tribe first stepped into entrepreneurship, Oakley was our first step to set us up for the worldwide recognition we have attained today. Now, the Seminole Tribe's Hard Rock Hotel and Casino, on the former site of Oakley, is a major South Florida tourist destination. Its income enables the Seminole Tribe to serve its tribal members, advocate for Seminole rights on local and federal levels, protect and conserve cultural traditions such as language and crafts, and educate the public on Seminole culture in a way that craft income never could have. Thanks. Okay. Yes. Hello all.
Make sure, there we go.
Okay, thank you. Wonderful. I don't know whether to laugh or cry, familiar story. I was struck by the marketing development, things you can wear in your normal, ordinary life, and how the flared skirts that were so evident in 1960 when the project, that craft center opened, were the au courant silhouette. And by 68, hem lengths were different, flares were different. Did the marketing development keep pace with fashion in any way, or did things just become obsolete and unfashionable?
That has always been a struggle. I think patchwork fashion was probably the thing that sold least, is the thing that Seminoles were most known for, but that it moved less because it didn't fit into settler fashion. And so, especially in the 1960s, there's actually a big craze in Florida. You see it a lot on Boy Scouts. Boy Scout troops would buy Seminole patchwork jackets. And so Seminoles came up with a jacket which went to here and had a flared collar called the Eisenhower jacket. And those were huge sellers, hugely productive for these craft development programs. Women's fashions, they were always struggling with keeping up with the fashion. And there was this moment in the 1950s, especially. Just yesterday, I was looking at an issue of McCall's Needlework, and they're teaching to make Seminole fashion. And they're like, it goes perfectly with the fashion of the times, a plain shirt, a bright skirt. You can't be more stylish than wearing a Seminole skirt. But certainly by the 70s, I'm looking at around 1980, these books teaching women again to make Seminole patchwork. And they're like, it's kind of blinding what's happening there. It's really beguiling, figuring out what is going on. You're going to want to figure out your own way to do this. That the colors the styles don't work in 1980. So yeah, it was a limiting factor, but it's really interesting, the success of the men's jackets. And those are used, the tribal chairman would wear them, and they're also used as sort of diplomatic gifts. You see people, they go to Senate, I think one's to the state Senate.
I know like Nixon ended up with one. Like those circulated to these two male politicians. These like this outfit of seminal leadership. So, then somehow also was like translated into masculine political leadership, or Seminoles tried to translate it into masculine political leadership by settler state politicians.
Any other questions? I see a hand creeping up.
Hi, Amanda. Thanks so much for the talk. I'm curious to knowing a little bit about the project and the sort of sources that you've found. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about working with oral histories that you yourself have conducted, and then the ones that you've found as kind of archival documents in their own right. I'm just curious, methodologically, do you think those play different roles? Have you found contradictions? Just I'd love to know a little bit more about, those materials and your methods with them.
That's a really meaty question, Colin. I don't know if I'm thanking you for asking it. So within the history of oral history taken, I'm just talking about with the Seminole, but I am sure this extends to marginalized populations throughout the country. There's these tremendous archives of oral histories with the Seminole that I just won't use, I just won't touch. That I can tell by the questions that are being asked that they're not respectful. They are, playing on stereotypes. Often they are asking, I don't feel like people sometimes know that they are being recorded, even if they like approve of the recording. In the 1960s, no one was conceptualizing that the internet would exist, that these would be in online archives. And so now with the historic oral histories, which a few of the quotes I used were from historic oral histories. I also use the Seminole Tribune, which is the tribal newspaper, as a source a lot, because the tribal newspaper isn't going to publish anything that should not be known. And I always get approval from the Seminole Tribe's Tribal Heritage Preservation Office before sharing quotes generally, just because I don't want to transgress. I know that there is a lot that has been recorded that perhaps that's certainly the Seminole Tribe now would not want recorded. And because of this legacy, there's a lot of distrust in communities to being recorded, to speaking to me, as a white woman coming in and researching, I am part of this heritage. And so I have tried to build relationships, but a lot of them don't result in recorded oral histories. People know what I'm doing and we have coffee and, talk, but the giving up of agency of recording, which happens with an recording, like people just aren't comfortable with that. So it's complicated.
Well, please join me in thanking Amanda Thompson.